make things better. And I'd like to ask Senator Jackson, should open us with a word of prayer, if you will, please.
Thank you. Let us pray.
Number 6. Yeah.
Gracious God, we give you thanks for this day, for this opportunity to gather with one another, to learn more about how we might care for those who have often been forgotten and not cared for. We pray especially for our friends who sleep outside, for those on the streets across our state. We ask, God, that you would guide and direct us, that we might be able to better shelter your people. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Before we get started, folks, please make sure your phones are on silent. You're welcome to text, whatever you do, but just make sure they're on silent. Don't interrupt anybody. And also, I'd like to say that this is not a Republican or Democrat issue. This issue is an issue to make Georgia a better place and to help folks that need help. And that's what we're here for. We're not looking to, incarcerate anybody. We're not looking to cause anybody harm. We're looking to take a problem that we obviously know we have, and it's certainly not indigenous to Atlanta. It's all over Georgia, and work to make, Georgia a better place to live for folks that as Ms. Jackson said, they're living on the street. And so that's what we're here for. We're going to try to follow the agenda as close as possible. I've got a couple of last minute add-ons. Some folks said they cannot stay past lunch. And so if we can squeeze these people in, we're going to try to give them their 10 minutes. So basically what we're going to do is try to give everybody a minimum of 10 minutes and then have a little follow-up questions from the panel here. And I want to thank everybody for, hey, Senator, how are you over there? Miss Gail, good to see you. I didn't see you walk in. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for all serving here, Judge Alina. Senator Dugan, Senator Jackson, Senator Robertson, thank you all. And let's just move this thing right along. And today we're going to get started with our DCA Chairman, Christopher Nunn. Chris, you're on the hot seat. Go to the mic and tell us who you are. Let's get this thing moving. And by the way, this is live stream. So let everybody know this live stream. You have to go to the website. Your choice. Okay.
Slideshow. I'll walk through it. Thank y'all for your time and honestly for your commitment to looking into this important issue. I am Christopher Nunn. I'm the commissioner. I just gave him this number. So
okay.
On the screen, I'll get you a copy of it.
Let's see your mic. What mic number are you, Chris?
Number 2.
Witness. Yeah, witness. I like witness.
So wonderful. So
we have a judge here, by the way.
I know we have a real judge. So
we have a real judge here.
So it's good to be with you. As most of you know, I'm the commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs. Among the various responsibilities of DCA, we service the state's housing agency, and as such, we're involved with helping local communities address a variety of housing issues, including homelessness, which is a complex topic, as you know, and one that's not easily resolved. We've been asked to provide a brief presentation, and so without any further direction, I've really just distilled a few high-level slides to to provide some context. And my team will be here to participate in the study committee going forward. I thought that it might be helpful and to just a level set with some definitions, because persons experiencing homelessness really fall at the bottom end of a broad housing spectrum. So on this very simple graphic, as you move to the right, that represents increasing housing stability. Of course, to the left represents housing instability. And your research would tell us that 1 in 14 Americans experience homelessness at some stage in life. The reality is that practically, that is oftentimes will resolve itself and may even include, temporary arrangements, living with family and friends, or couch surfing and the like. I'm going to focus on a narrower definition, one that is used by HUD in the biennial point and time count. And that really is focused on those who live in shelters or who live on the streets in places that are unfit for human habitation. Now, given the focus of this committee, I will focus most of my attention on those at the far left end of this spectrum, which is those unsheltered homeless. Let's start with some data. The number of homeless individuals in the state of Georgia has been declining for the past 10 years. In particular, you will notice that the unsheltered homeless population depicted here in red has declined most significantly. Now, I will tell you, this slide is not intended to convince anyone that we don't have a problem. First off, this is point in time count data, and it is simply that. It is a snapshot of a single night at what the census looks like across our state. Second of all, any homeless population in our state should be concerning. And thirdly, I will note that the 2021 count was actually postponed for obvious reasons and was just conducted earlier this year. HUD has not released that report yet, but I can tell you for the balance of state, which we are responsible for, those numbers have increased in 2021. Okay. So the real purpose for sharing this graphic is this. This trend did not happen by luck. I encourage you over the course of the day to listen to some of our fellow Georgians who have helped to move the needle through their hard work, their commitment, proven approaches, lessons learned, and other lived experience. Now, I really intend to focus on what we're doing in Georgia, but this is a national problem, and so it's helpful to have a little bit of context. Very briefly here, you can look at how our numbers stack up against Washington State and the state of Texas. So you'll notice in Washington State that their numbers have actually increased slightly, most notably among their unsheltered population. In Texas, they've seen a dip, although their unsheltered population certainly is more significant than in Georgia, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of the overall population. So you may ask, as my wife did, why'd you pick Washington and Texas? Well, remember I said that the 2022 point in time count has not been released, but HUD has already told us that the 3 states that have experienced the most significant increase in homelessness are California, Texas, and Washington. Okay, so why did I leave California off? Well, when you look at those numbers, which are so astounding, it really makes all the rest of the data very difficult to understand. When you think about 108,000 unsheltered homeless living on the streets, and that's a number that we have been told has increased significantly. That is truly astounding. In Georgia, our numbers reflect approximately 0.1% of our total population. In California, that's 3.5% of their population is living on the streets. So when you have such astounding numbers, in response, there often are innovators and people who have grand ideas about new and better solutions to address the need. Now, some of those ideas, like parasite shelters in alleyways and putting people in concrete, housing people in concrete pipes, are admittedly a bit dubious. Others, like this homeless care bus, or even the notion of 3D printed housing, likely have application in certain circumstances. With respect to this latter point, while 3D printed houses are certainly technologically innovative, they are expensive. So I'm not suggesting that as a grand solution, but there are lots of new ideas that are worth ferreting out. When these ideas are accretive, as opposed to in place of or in opposition to proven solutions that are already in place, the numbers certainly suggest that there is room for new ideas, for doers to do the work, and for us to make greater strides. In our experience, when you look at and consider these proposed solutions, there are a handful of questions to ask. One, what is the need that the solution seeks to solve? Two, has the approach been tested? If so, what were the results? How reasonable and how scalable is that? And 3, regarding the service provider, what's their experience? How sustainable are they? And where do they get their funding? So, innovation can be appealing and certainly have an impact, but it's really important that we not overlook proven results. My kids and I know y'all have probably been to the Air Force Museum down in Robbins. My kids and I were there recently, and we're admiring all these really cool aircraft, but none more so than the B-52 Stratofortress. And it's kind of interesting. The U.S. strategic bomber fleet has more technologically advanced aircraft like the stealth bomber that is about to be replaced. But what is the backbone of the strategic bomber fleet? The 60-plus-year-old B-52. And why is that? It's because it works. It's proven. And so I think it's important for us not to discount the hard work and the proven success that we have experienced. This is a recent New York Times article that highlighted Houston's success in addressing chronic homelessness, which is really what we're here to talk about. And the article has sparked much discussion. I'm sure that y'all have read it, and you probably noticed that it touted Atlanta and the success that we have seen in our state. Appropriately, this article it focuses on the providers who are actually doing the work, the woman in the upper right. And that's appropriate because, and this is a really important point, the state plays no direct role in providing homeless services. We provide funding to various service providers. And in our state, sorry, I went one step too far. In our state, this network of providers includes nonprofits. It includes faith-based organizations. Places like Must Ministries in Cobb and Cherokee County, Salvation Army and the United Way all across the state, City of Refuge, Covenant House, Atlanta Mission, Three Keys, and many more. Now, I really hope and encourage you to take note of the work that these organizations are doing. But I want to highlight Must Ministries to make a simple point about funding. In 2021, according to their audit, Must Ministries had $16 million in operating revenue. Okay. Primarily, those funds came from philanthropy and private donations. In 2021, approximately 25% of their revenue did come from public sources, mostly or all federal. Most of that was stimulus, one-time stimulus monies like emergency rental assistance and the like. But the important point is that not only is homeless outreach done at a local level, but it is also generally funded at the local level. I don't have time to explain all the various federal programs and funding sources, but suffice it to say, those are limited and really are used to augment those local efforts. And in some cases, providers eschew public federal funds because they don't want to deal with the federal rules, and that's okay. There is ample room for us to address the need. Now, there are also some really exciting initiatives that are taking place in our state. If you look around on the left-hand side of this page, this is a picture of Hand in Hand in Glenn County down in Brunswick. They are well on their way to building 60 one-bedroom tiny homes on property that was previously owned by the Presbyterian Church. Land cost is a significant cost of construction. This was a fantastic effort. There are no public dollars in that project. Similarly, the Savannah-Chatham County Continuum of Care has developed the Cove at Dundee on the upper right to provide refuge for homeless veterans in close proximity to downtown with jobs and vital services. On Monday, just Monday of this week, they cut the ribbon on phase 3 of this development, which is made possible entirely by private funding and in-kind support with no public investment. There's a similar development in Macon, and I'm sure you're going to be hearing from the judge on the great work that you're doing out in Douglas County, supported by the faith-based community, the faith community in your area. All of these initiatives are important and can be impactful when it comes to addressing the need. So my time is short, so I just want to conclude with 2 points. The first is, what issue are we trying to resolve? Is it this or is it this? So I will tell you, both of these are troubling to me. But to the second point, I don't have enough information to tell you if this family, and I presume that that's a family, if they are unsheltered, if they slept in a shelter last night, or if they live in the low rent apartments that are right behind here. The point, unsheltered homelessness is really just the tip of the iceberg. And so one of the easiest ways maybe to see this, and I will tell you, these numbers are certainly not comprehensive. This is but one of many federal funding source programs in the state, but you can see that through local providers, the federal funds that we receive go to, across the state, go to a variety of activities, not only emergency shelter, housing 8,000 to 10,000 people in a given year, but also prevention and rapid rehousing. Prevention is really just vouchers to keep people housed when they are at the bottom of that rope, about to fall off. And you can see that the people who would be kind of intersecting with the system tend to be folks who already have connection to DFACS, to DBHDD, and represent really high-risk communities. The rapid rehousing, this represents truly homeless individuals who go through a process and are prioritized because they're limited funds and are prioritized to get back on their feet. And again, here you can see that children, victims of domestic violence, those with severe mental illness and disability constitute a significant portion of those who benefit from these services. My very last point is simply this. Who remembers the 3 states that have experienced the most significant increases in homelessness, or so we're told? Washington State, California, and Texas. So anybody want to hazard a guess at what those states have in common? So certainly 2 of them are on the West Coast, where land costs are through the roof, and that contributes. But in all 3 of those states, the cost of housing has increased substantially. The rents have increased substantially. And so housing affordability is something that is a really important factor, and it is very tightly intertwined with homelessness. Here in Metro Atlanta, Atlanta Regional Commission recently came out with numbers suggesting that the city of Atlanta, that Metro Atlanta had lost 60,000 units of rental housing that rent for less than $1,250 a month over the last 5 years. That's significant. At DCA, where we administer the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which we all know, as Section 8, we have 970 households that currently hold a housing choice voucher, a commitment from the federal government to pay their rent, that can't find a place to live. They are effectively homeless. Now, I don't have the details. I don't know if they're sleeping on, somebody's couch or if they're sleeping on the street, but supply and affordability are inextricably linked with homelessness. And I just thought that was an important point to share with this committee. Thanks for the time. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to just set some context, and look forward to answering any questions now or as the day goes on.
Questions from the committee? Senator Robertson.
Mr. Commissioner, thank you for being here. The State Housing Trust Fund falls under your department. Is that
That's
correct?
correct.
Is that where all the funding comes out that deals with all of the programs that your department's responsible for related to housing and homelessness?
No. And I will tell you, we could spend an hour, talking about funding and HUD programs and the like. The Housing Trust Fund, to clarify that, the Housing Trust Fund for the last 15 years has received approximately $3 million in state appropriations. Those $3 million are used simply to match federal funds for the balance of state continuum of care. Complex program, one of 9 in the state. And we draw down approximately $20 million a year from HUD, but that requires a match. And so that's what those state housing trust fund dollars are for.
When you say a match, sometimes it's not a dollar for dollar match though, right? Sometimes, yeah,
Correct.
sometimes, and I think the numbers I got from your agency is for $1 that come out of that fund, the feds on average put in around $9.
That's probably correct. And I can check with my folks on that. And the match occurs really in 2 ways. One, we have to put dollars into the program in order to draw down those funds from Washington. We also have to provide certain things that HUD will not fund in order to use the program. And so that $3 million is in the State Housing Trust Fund is simply to support the continuum of care. You ask if that's where all of the homeless funds in the state flow. There is also, and Georgia has, and this is where things get confusing. If you want to talk about funding, we can come back and sit down for an hour and do so. There are about 25 entitlement communities in the state of Georgia that receive direct funds. Not all of them receive all different sorts of funds, but emergency solution grants flow directly to the state through DCA and directly to, I believe it's probably 8 or 9 different communities, and those aren't necessarily the same as the continuum of care. It's complex. Funding is complex, and if you want to go into it, I'm happy to to dive in. With
Well, I certainly don't want to take up the chairman's time to go into it right now, but I think because of the fact that we've got an issue and we're paying for it with tax dollars that come from the pockets of taxpayers in the
Right.
state of Georgia and outside the state of Georgia. I do think for us and for the taxpayers to understand how we're addressing this problem, I think that there needs to be a clarification on exactly because going through this, looking at the funding to begin with, what I realize is it's a very convoluted, bureaucratic, and my fear is a system that is fraught with duplication of services, and not necessarily not in your silo by any stretch, but looking around at what communities are doing, I see a lot of money being invested that your group puts a little bit of funding in, but then they go out and use the same testimonials and narratives to get funding to what seems to be to address the exact same problem. Not to compliment what y'all are doing. Y'all are doing what you've always done and have obviously a good track record, but who conducts the audits of the individuals that receive the funding from you guys? Is that a federal?
It's because these are all federal funds,
Right, except the portion of state funding that's required to bring the federal funds in.
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct.
So
I can't tell you which branch of HUD. I've got 2 HUD auditors in right now working on different things. We are audited continuously. I don't know if my team has.
and we could get that. I said, like you said, that's a much longer conversation. I just wanted to be clear. that-
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I'm happy to sit
I
down.
do.
We could probably spend, a couple of hours.
That's right.
Unfurling the the
And
complication that it
and
is.
just for a point of clarification, none of those questions were mean, were they?
Listen, I appreciate the work that y'all are doing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Commissioner, on that 980 vouchers that you have,
970.
970, what is that money? How much is that? Is that $500 a month rent, $800 a month, $1,000 a month rent? What is that?
So again, Senator Summers, this is the way that the Housing Choice Voucher Program works is an extraordinarily complicated earned income model.
Okay.
It is based on need. It is based on rents. it is not a simple formula, and it is not a, here's, $500 a month. The issue today is that there are no landlords to fit the need, whether those landlords were charging $500 a month or $700 a month or $1,000 a month. Now, and I think my colleagues from DBHDD will speak a little bit to this. We are all doing our part on the landlord outreach side to try to drive to improve that the availability of housing stock, of affordable housing stock. But when you look at the amount of investment that has come into the state, when you look at, frankly, both on the multifamily and the single family side, I know in our rural communities, there are, most of our rental stock is single family homes. The pricing has gone, out the roof, and understandably, if I own something and I want to make $1 off of it, I'm going to make the most money.
That's sort of my point. I think what's happening is rents have gone so high that this doesn't compete anymore, or doesn't get anybody excited anymore. Right. If you will. Any more questions from the committee, for the commissioner? Judge, what number are you there on your mic?
Number 2.
Go ahead, sir.
Oh, you get to kill the mic.
Absolutely.
Power of the chair, right?
So I'll do well if the mic doesn't get killed. In other words,
You're doing fine.
Just 2 points I wanted to ask you about, Mr. Nunn. There's a saying that there's lies and there's damn lies and there's statistics. And I think it comes from Mark Twain, if I'm not mistaken. When you made the point about how homelessness is on the decline in the state of Georgia, I think the public would laugh at you, because the public perception is 1000% the opposite. Do you have any thoughts about why the public sees a different picture, who these folks are responsive to, than the data?
To be really crystal clear, I did not say that the numbers are on the decline.
Just that
I was
count.
crystal clear
Point in time
that in 2022, which is the delayed count, that those numbers have increased. So I completely agree with you, Judge, that we have a problem that needs to be addressed, and B, we have seen an increased need over the last 3 years.
Well,
No
the point I was
question.
trying to make is that so many decisions are driven by what we call data.
Yes,
Everybody wants data.
that's right.
Everybody wants data. They want data. The funders want data.
Right.
I'm looking at data, decline in homelessness from 20K to 10K since 2011. And there's nobody in the state of Georgia that believes that. It's just the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. So if I could just really quickly respond to that. First of all, I appreciate you allowing me to clarify that I am not here contending that the numbers have declined in the last 3 years. Second of all, I agree with you. We can sit here and debate whether Georgia's census numbers, are correct or not. It's data. It's the only and the best data that we have. And my point in sharing that point in time, which I caveated with the fact that it is literally it's a balance sheet. It's a snapshot.
It's very inaccurate.
So,
Because
there are
I've
lots
been personally
Right.
done point in time counts.
Right. There are a lot of communities in South Georgia that would claim that the census is inaccurate, but most of our federal funding flows as a result of, our census, which says we've got, roughly 10.9 million people in the state. The census of the homeless population, which is a very difficult population to count. And I know you know that because you do the work. That's the census data that we have. And so I shared it really just to make a point that there are a lot of people like yourself that are doing good work to try to drive those numbers down, even though they've increased the last 3 years.
And the second and final quick point, I agree with you totally on the market forces that are making the situation worse and worse and worse and worse. I think everyone's seeing that when you put a house on the market and you get 25 overpriced offers in
Right.
1 hour.
Right.
It's a dire situation. So my question is, are you familiar with how the market is responding to that with a pad split type model. In other words, entrepreneurs
Mhm.
are taking houses, and instead of the model that we can't sustain because we can't afford it.
Right.
They're taking a house and they're renting a room, 4 rooms out of the house. Everybody has their own digital lock, common areas shared. And so the capitalist can make a profit on their real estate investment, and someone can have an affordable place to live. Are
Right.
you
And
familiar with that?
And Pad Split is a fantastic Atlanta-based company. Super excited about that sort of innovation. And yes, there's certainly room for innovation and for new ideas and new approaches.
Because we can just say, we're going to throw $1 billion and buy everybody a house. How are we going to buy them? Who are we
Right.
going to buy them from? And
Right.
who's going to sell them to us?
Right.
The-
Yeah,
the mo- We can't control the free market.
That's right. Absolutely. I am in no way suggesting that we interfere with free market. I made the point. I'm just making a point that is a contributing factor, which I think you and I agree on.
52% of the housing in Douglas County where I live is not owned by the people who live in it.
Right. Yeah. We see. So statewide, the home ownership rate in Georgia is about 65%, which the inverse of that, would tell you that, 35% are, renters. In some parts of the state, we have seen, look down in Dougherty County, approximately 60% of the population in Dougherty County rents their home. And that's not multifamily apartments. Those are, older housing stock, in that community. We've seen those numbers go up, and you're exactly right. That's a challenge. And, again, welcome. There's ample room for new ideas and new approaches. So.
And finally, and I don't want to take up too much time,
Yeah.
but on the question of marketplace, would you agree with me that when we first started building in-town suites and suburban lodges and weekly stay places, people would come, they would work somewhere for a month or two, they would leave. It was economical to do that instead of rent by the day. And now families live in these places on a semi-permanent basis, and school buses arrive to pick up their kids and take them to school. And all of this is partly driven by the marketplace.
Yeah, I think the data would absolutely support that point. And, back to your original point about point in time count, and it's why I shared that level setting, definition at the front. Those people are not counted as homeless by the point in time count because they are in extended stay or living on. So absolutely, I think the data supports that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Judge. What's your number, Ms. Gail? No.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here. Just briefly, can you tell, we know we're in a housing crisis, and DCA administers all of this, but we still have people calling us saying they can't get any assistance, whether it's from the local community or from the state.
Right.
And so if you can just tell me how much money do we have, how much has been allocated to these areas, how much has been used, and how much is unused?
Absolutely. So to clarify, the question is about emergency rental assistance. And I mentioned that briefly, when I was talking about Must Ministries, federal funding. So the to date since March of 2021, when the state was the first of 13 programs in the state to stand up our emergency rental assistance. Since then, collectively, all 13 programs have distributed more than $600 million in rental assistance to Georgians. That most of those funds go directly to landlords. Some landlords choose not to participate. The federal requirements, then indicate that those funds go to the tenant. The state has disseminated the majority of that. It's really kind of about half and half between what the state and what the other 12 local programs have disseminated. The state program, and I do have to brag because I'm really proud of my team. The state program has disseminated more money than all but 20 of more than 500 programs that Treasury established nationwide. We have, and I'd have to look at the latest projections, we probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of 190 million left. But our pipeline and the fact that we're disseminating about 50 million a month you can kind of do the math on kind of where that program stands. We've processed more than 125,000 applications, and that's just the state, not those other 13 local programs. So a lot of work. And again, the takeaway, more than $600 million in rental assistance into the
Okay,
state.
and you can get us the information about each of these counties. I represent 2 of them. And I
Absolutely.
want, okay. 'Cause
Absolutely.
people just keep calling us saying
Yeah.
they can't get any help.
Yeah, I was
We
talking
knew
to
we
the,
were going to have a housing crisis when we looked at it, and we were in the middle of COVID. And this housing crisis is right here with us, and people can't. The rent has gone up $300 and $400 a month, and there's some
Right.
people have not paid their mortgage, can't pay. it.
right,
And they're in a crisis. Then landlords are calling us
Right.
because when they were not paid. So I just want to know.
yeah, I was
about the
talking to
money.
Chairman Turner last week. Absolutely, we can get you the data on that.
Oh, okay, very good. And we have problems with our counties. We just call you and you take care of it. Is that right?
You can call me.
And what is your cell phone number?
Okay.
That's
Commissioner, thank you for your testimony. If you said some of your team will be here during the day?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm joined today by my deputy commissioner and our director of all of our home ownership, or excuse me, our rental assistance programs. And so they will be here today to answer any questions. I'm happy to come back, but I appreciate the opportunity to kick us off and really thank you all for your service.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, guys, we extended a little courtesy here to the commissioner to give him a few more extra minutes. Next, we have Dr. Bambi Hayes. Dr. Hayes, there she is. I have the pleasure of knowing Dr. Hayes. She is instrumental on both sides of this issue, and I'm delighted that you'd come and testify with us this morning. Make a point. I'll try my best to keep us on time. I know you will too.
Okay.
Thank you, Doc.
Most definitely. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your kind words. And I have several of Georgia Act, our members and our partners and our advocate that is here today. But I also want to especially note that I have 2 of Georgia Act members, Lethea Cottrell, who is with Fitzgerald for Change, who represents a rural organization that is working with those who are unhoused in Fitzgerald, Ben Hill County, as well as Helen Cummings, who is the director of the Beloved Community Development Corporation, who is also doing direct services with the unhoused in Southwest Atlanta. And so they will also be around to answer any questions. So again, my name is Dr. Bambi Hayes Brown, and I serve as the President and Chief Executive Officer of Georgia Advancing Communities Together, also known as Georgia Act. And we are a statewide nonprofit, affordable housing and community development membership organization. And I come to you today not only as the CEO of Georgia Act, but also as someone who has lived experience of being homelessness while I was pregnant with my youngest son and my older 2 children, as well as a former practitioner who has managed a homeless program in DeKalb County. Just to give you some context, back in 2019, it was just before the pandemic, and I met with a few housing advocates, and we were talking about how to solve the eviction crisis in Fulton County. And most of these advocates were very well-known, well-respected nationally and internationally, and called upon to give testimony in various occasions. However, I asked one question: how many of those advocates had actually been in the Fulton County's eviction court? Not one. So tell me, how can you really understand what the problem is, but you're called on as an expert, but you've never even been to a Fulton County eviction court? Of course, I have. And unfortunately, when I was a property manager in Southwest Atlanta, I had to actually conduct evictions. I guess that's why I'm not doing property management anymore. When I look at the things in the documentary, No Address, Atlanta, and if you have not seen that, it is the best $14 I have ever spent to rent. and watch. Because it highlights how only a few organizations control the millions of dollars in funding and control the decisions of homelessness. And according to past Atlanta president Felicia Moore, there is a disconnect between the controllers of the funding administrators, the continuum of care against those who are doing the on the ground work and those who are unsheltered. And I have heard this throughout my career, and I heard one of my friends and advocates, we pray for his healing, Marshall Ransford, stated that one time he had conducted a lead agency in Atlanta regarding an issue for the unhoused. He did receive a call, but it was 6 months later. I requested assistance from my fellow advocates that are part of an ad hoc state housing working group to aid our partners in Valdosta, Georgia. So you're right, Mr. Chairman, this is not just an Atlanta issue. Only the Housing Justice League, who is an on-the-ground grassroots organization that's also severely underfunded, responded. So I come to you to see how many of my fellow advocates, some of whom will speak today, scholars, academians, in this homeless space, has taken the time to live without shelter on the hottest day of the year, as well as try to live without shelter on the coldest day of the year, and try not to die like the 28 unsheltered people who died due to hypothermia because of the cities of Atlanta's slow response to open home warming shelters. Accompany an unsheltered brother or sister through navigating this continuum of care while trying to navigate intake, getting all of the required documents. And a lot of these organizations are, guess what, closed on the weekends. Like homelessness doesn't occur on the weekends. Accompany family in Valdosta through the application for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, only to submit that program 4, 5, and 6 times, only to get an email saying that they are approved, and then another email saying they're denied. And guess what? Try contacting someone to get a solution. Then you see the same fate that Senator Davenport so eloquently put. Then the constituents start calling you all because they can't get any assistance. One of the things that we often do in this space is we refer to data, focus groups, surveys, but rarely do those who will say, well, we don't provide direct services, move away from the comforts of their homes or their Zoom meetings and do like Senator Summers, Senator Jackson, and actually go out into the community, whether you ride, whether you walk, whether you drive by foot, anything, to talk to those who are unsheltered. Find out from them what their needs are. So you're not getting second and third hand information based on data. Just like Judge said, it's so true. As someone who travels around this state, to hear that homelessness has declined, even back in 2019, is laughable because the public perception is the reality. Tell someone who is unhoused that homelessness is declining. And I know that Senator Summers faced a lot of flack when this bill first came out to say, oh, well, he just rode around and saw what he saw. Well, guess what? Go view No Address Atlanta, and that validates everything that Senator Summers, Senator Jackson, who goes out and do this work on the ground, and that they do. Although the numbers and reasons for homelessness are vast, the numbers of homelessness continue to increase, as Commissioner Nunn stated. So according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, 73% of extremely low income renters are cost burden, which means they pay more than 50% of their income for rent. Georgia has only 39 available units for 100 extremely low income families. And then in the state of Georgia, a person has to make $20.97 per hour to afford a modest 2-bedroom unit. And God forbid, if they're making minimum wage, they have to work 116 hours per week to afford a 2-bedroom unit. So as a former practitioner of homelessness, and as someone who is also participating in those point in time counts, which we know are only estimates, and when we go out and do those counts, it goes by what we see and people that we can count in shelters. But talk to Helen Cummings about the people that you're not going to see. Because a lot of times those who are unsheltered don't want to be seen or don't want to be found. Because we talk about in this bill, the criminalization of homelessness. Well, guess what? It's been happening. It already happens. We talk about things such as compassionate closures. When people don't have a place to put their tents, and boulders are now put in place. These encampments are raised, and now people lose all the things that they need to get services: identification, birth certificates, medications, bus passes, cell phones. So we're also still feeling the effects of the closure of Peachtree and Pine Shelter. And I volunteered at that shelter from 2001 until 2013. So no one can tell me about, oh, well, Peachtree and Pine Shelter. Yes, they had some issues, of course, but it did serve a need. Just like the time when I was sitting in a meeting and people talked about closing these extended stay hotels because of all of the seedy things that was happening. And I challenged them to get out of their office and go at 7:30 in the morning to those extended stays, at 3:30 in the afternoon to those extended stays. And tell me, won't you see children that are out there? Because I lived in one for 3 years. So I know what I'm talking about. Tell that to the people who have already spent 28 days in jail in the city of Atlanta, the 500 intents to evict in Valdosta, Lowndes County, the almost 300 eviction filings in Fitzgerald, Ben Hill County, and the lady who lived in an encampment in Valdosta under a tree, and the tree limb fell on her and she died. These are real stories that are happening. You're not going to see this in the data, and you're going to hear a lot about data. But we want to really look at those who are doing the work on the ground, who are oftentimes left out of the conversation of the solutions and are often left out of the money, such as the beloved Community Development Corporation that provides rest and respite for those who are unhoused, food, charging stations, showers, clothes washing stations. And they only need $7,000 to complete their Little Zion Annex that serves the Pittsburgh community of Southwest Atlanta. $7,000. And with $30,000 a year, they can have full operations. $30,000 a year. But we, and it's a great question about how many millions of dollars are coming into the community, but how many are coming to those grassroots organizations like Fitzgerald for Change, who are fielding those calls from people who need rental assistance, who qualify for the balance of states rental assistance, but are unable to get the assistance, and the landlords just can't hold out. So they have to file those evictions. So some solutions, as Senator Robertson, I think you stole a little bit of my thunder, have an independent periodic review along with metrics and benchmarks of the success or failures of those agencies who are currently administrating government dollars on homelessness, local, state, and federal. Of course, remove any criminalization of the unsheltered. We all agree on that. Solutions that are led by those with lived experience and those who are doing on-the-ground grassroots work, and those persons of color, because they are the ones that are disproportionately affected by homelessness. But in these spaces, when it's time to talk in front of the White House or sometimes in front of a group such as this, they're left out of the conversations. And even those who are allies, unintentionally or intentionally, depending on who you ask, want to mediate what we're going to say. What those of us who have done the on the ground work and have that lived experience. We need, our expertise is just as valuable as those academians and attorneys, and no shade on attorneys, or academians, are all of these experts. We are the experts because we have been there, done that. We need equitable, low barrier distribution of homelessness dollars to those on the ground nonprofits. We need increased funding for long-term housing solutions, including permanent supportive housing and some of the other solutions that you're here today. Also consider those innovative short-term housing solutions, those low barrier shelters, tiny homes, shipping container homes that Jessica Lewis and Tony Popes talks about in the documentary No Address. Provide funding for those like Erica Wright with You First that provides hand washing stations, and Justice for All, my friend Marsha Ransiford, that aids the unhoused with mental illness and substance abuse. And lastly, again, view the documentary No Address from Carlotta Harris and take heed to those solutions in the documentary. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and committee, and I'll be glad to entertain any questions now. I do plan to be around later today.
Dr. Brown, excellent testimony. Thank you kindly for that, and I appreciate your own, as we say, your own spirits, own hand job there. You're there. One question, well, actually two, before we let you go. The criminal part, thank you for bringing up the part about the criminalization in that bill that was dropped last year. It simply was that bill basically mirrored what was already on the books with Georgia law in regards to a police officer having the right to say, if you don't move after a while, I have the right to arrest you to move you. Nobody wants to criminalize anybody. Thank you for pointing that out. That was not part of it. But people want to focus on that because they don't want to focus on the issue. And thank you for pointing out the issue on that, on where we're at, because you're hands-on. Thank you very much for that. And one more thing, let me rephrase that. From what I gather from you, you're basically saying there's no accountability to the massive amount of funding that's coming into Georgia. Is that correct?
That is correct, because you will hear one thing from the administrators of the program,
Right.
but you all are hearing something different from your constituents.
Absolutely.
As well as we are, because we get those phone calls to Senator Davenport a lot. And so that's what I would like to see as an outcome from this committee.
Okay.
And it needs to be independent. And because we, I think the judge here said it all.
What number are you, Mike? Senator?
It's kind of I'll be shocked if you know it. Do you know how many programs are out there that provide assistance?
I wish I did. Unfortunately, I don't.
And that's kind of why I was asking the question, because every time I hear somebody talk, I'm hearing about another program that's available, but we don't have a full list of.
How do you get it?
Yeah. And you probably need that information more than I do.
That is correct. Because we need to know where to send families, but we don't want to have families just going around in a circle saying, okay, well, dial 211 and here's a list of agencies. And well, this agency, well, the list is outdated. We don't have any funding, or we don't have any services available, or come back at 2 o'clock on a Monday while you're trying to work and you're at work at 2 o'clock. So it would be helpful to have a comprehensive list of that. And even though we know it will change and it will be a working list, but it would be great for those of us who are doing the work on the ground and our partners who are doing the work on the ground to have.
Since we're trying to figure that thing out and get solutions on that one, part two on that is I would like to see how much of those dollars are spent on admin costs for the entity and how much are going to the costs.
Absolutely.
I agree. And I think that is a great idea because when I look at the beloved community who only needs $7,000 and to finish their capital project and $30,000 a year to help families. And as as stated in the No Address documentary, I'm not saying this is me, but they are saying that there are some program administrators that receive pay in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Again, don't doubt it. Commissioner Ross?
Thank you for being here. First of all, are you an executive producer on No Address Atlanta? Just wanna-
I am not. I have never met Miss Harris.
No.
But
I'm just-
she did. She was spot on.
I'm just joking with you.
I
If
understand.
you could start promoting Robertson for Georgia, I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
But in all seriousness, and to the majority leader's question, when I reached into the budget office here in the state capitol and asked them that question, where I wanted to see where all the funding for homelessness was going into, and understand, I look at it as a two-part thing. I look at unsheltered differently than I look at traditional homelessness.
Right.
And I think it's important that we do that, because when we look at traditional homelessness, we can have a conversation about what the judge is talking about the market, housing,
Correct.
apartment availability and things like that. I think when we get over into the unsheltered, a lot of times the market doesn't impact it as much as substance abuse, mental health issues, and other things related to disconnectivity at home, whether it's,
Right.
my oldest child grew up in a generation where she had friends that all through college, they couch surfed and
Right.
attended college, but they never had a residence. So we have to be very careful about that. But do you notice while you're out there, and you mentioned this nonprofit that needs $7,000, and of course, the first thought that popped into my mind is there not a church out there that's willing to write this nonprofit a check for $7,000, and are there not 3 churches out there that are willing to each give them $10,000 a year to run this program, which sounds like a part of the solution. But as a young law enforcement officer, United Way was the clearinghouse for all of these things.
Right.
And a lot of people didn't like United Way because a portion of any contribution had administrative strings to it. But what we discovered is if they were administering most of the funding to these programs, we saved money on the administrative costs of all these individual programs.
Right.
In other words, there was a point of contact and things were done that way. And it seems we've moved away from that model into where everybody wants to establish their program, and in some cases their kingdoms. And because throughout the legislative session, every advocate that comes and sits before us throws out a new acronym, some
Right.
new name or something like that. And it's gotten to the point to where I, as a law enforcement officer, have become so jaded and cynical, because I understand that you can take $20 and go start a 501c3 in the state of Georgia.
That's true.
And I'm a little conservative when it comes for me handing somebody taxpayer dollars to a group that does not have a track record and is not affiliated with somebody that is reputable and has been vetted. So God bless you. I appreciate what you do. And I'm certainly going to watch the documentary and see what all that's about. But thank you again.
Yes, thank you. No address. Thank you. Thank you so much. And that is a valid point. My agency in transparency has received money from United Way of Greater Atlanta. Before all of this federal dollars came out, we had our own rental assistance program. And we had a 7-day turnaround with giving out money because I was driving the checks to the apartment complexes myself. But I agree. But we just need those agencies such as United Way or those who are handling the money to widen the table, to broaden the table, to include those small community development organizations who are asking for just a little bit of money that has a great impact.
Okay, last question from Senator Jackson.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you so much for all of your work, Dr. Brown. I really appreciate it. Dr. Hayes Brown.
Thank you.
Just thinking about your issue around wanting to make sure that the grassroots agencies have access to the federal dollars. So I think, to be clear, these are federal funds which come with a lot of rules and regulations. I run a small church. I personally do not have the capacity administratively to be able to fulfill all of the documentation, all the paperwork that would be required in order to actually receive federal dollars. And so I'm curious, I mean, I know all the agents, I know all the groups that you've named, right? How would you solve that problem without adding to people's administrative burden, right? I mean, the thing is, we don't want to pay executives to have to do this work, but the fact is, federal dollars require true documentation, lots of paperwork. There's accountability that's been built into it, and if you're an agency that runs with 2 people, how are they supposed to meet those needs, and what solution might you offer for that problem?
Well, I'll give you a perfect example of
Please.
that. And so I'm not talking about just federal or state dollars that these larger agencies need to share. I'm talking about private philanthropic dollars also. What we don't want to see, and I advocate on the federal level as well, and as someone who worked for a housing authority for 10 years, trust me, I know bureaucracy and paperwork, who's administered several of these programs that we are talking about today. That's why we advocated to Department of Treasury, who is running the who is administering the ERA programs, as opposed to HUD on the federal level, to loosen a lot of those federal requirements that you would just see in your traditional programs. So a lot of things such as, the federal government, Department of Treasury, they do allow people to get the funding directly to the renter. They don't require Social Security cards. But when the administrators of those programs add on additional requirements that are not required by the federal government, then that causes another problem. And so I have seen that also with the states. But we also need those who get the funding to work with those nonprofits who may not have the capacity. Because our small nonprofits, some who are represented here today, are tired of hearing that they don't have the capacity, when those larger nonprofits are receiving the bulk share of the dollars and the bulk share of the administrative costs. And again, as in the documentary stated, those are the ones that are getting the 6-figure incomes. But we need them to work with those on the ground grassroots nonprofits and share with them. And it may not be necessary. Resources is not just money. It's your best practices, things that you do that could help build the capacity of that nonprofit. I do a lot of that. My colleague here for Fitzgerald for Change, she will tell you, I give a lot of free, what I call free technical assistance to them. And that's what we need our agencies who are administering these funding, having their staff, if they don't do it, have a staff or member or someone dedicated to assisting these nonprofits so that they can work together as opposed to against each other.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please stay around if you don't mind
I
today.
sure will.
Thank you. Okay, guys, we're getting a little bit behind time, but I'm trying to give everybody an opportunity. Maxwell Rupersberg, did I say that right? Rupersberg, okay. And you're with, tell us who you're with, go ahead.
DBHTD, Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities for the state of Georgia. Now we're pulling up a slideshow here. Thank you. So good morning, Chairman Summers, Senators, Judge, committee members, and attendees of today's meeting. So my name is Maxwell Rupersberg, and I serve with DBHTD, again, Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, as the director for the Office of Supportive Housing. I'm a lifelong Georgia resident from Athens, attended Emory University, went to Syracuse for my MPA, and then returned to Georgia, where I worked in local government in Cobb County before joining the state with DBHTD. In my current capacity, I also represent DBHTD on the boards for the Balance of State Continuum of Care. That's represented by DCA, which covers 152 of 159 counties and distributes HUD funding to those service agencies around the state, as well as the Atlanta Continuum of Care Board, which does the same In Atlanta, of the state's 9 COCs, these 2 are the largest. This is also in addition to other bodies and committees such as today's Senate Study Committee, which I'm happy to present to, and be able to listen to today's presentations and testimonies. As Commissioner Nunn previewed, Georgia, like other states, is facing a shortage of housing stock and a shortage of housing assistance. Make this work. Whoops. Here we go. Sorry about that. So we are facing a shortage of housing stock and a shortage of housing assistance for those who need it. In the work that I do, this is probably our largest challenge in getting individuals who qualify for support into housing. So as you heard, while the 2022 point in time count for Atlanta illustrated the number of unsheltered individuals went down, and the balance of state count showed a mild increase throughout the state outside of Atlanta, there are clearly plenty of people that still need help, and there are not enough resources to go around. This hard truth is on display in our communities around the state. When we see our neighbors, Georgians, living on the street, the right response is to be upset. And as we work on solutions, it's important to understand what the system looks like currently, why it looks the way that it does, and where barriers exist that keep people on the streets here in Georgia. To start, it's helpful to look at what's happening on the ground. There are hundreds of case managers, peer specialists, and clinicians throughout our system around the state whose mission it is to meet people where they are with compassion and support for their personal journey to recovery, wellness, and independence. Last fiscal year, DBHDD funded outreach teams contacted over 3,400 Georgians with severe mental illness who are experiencing homelessness. We fund 10 teams around the state in collaboration with the Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, that's called SAMHSA. This program is known as the Projects for Assistance for Transition from Homelessness, or the PATH program. However, this doesn't begin to account for the thousands of unique contacts made by other homeless outreach agencies around the state. But the reality is this: while we are successfully making contact and have done a great deal of work to improve our systems, there are many people, hundreds just in our own system, who are currently experiencing homelessness, living without shelter, who are either on a waiting list for a spot to open up for housing, people who have a voucher but are having trouble locating housing where they can use it or that will accept their application, and people that are receiving ongoing outreach while they continue to live in an unsheltered situation and as they continue moving toward making a change. If you talk to any one of those individuals on the ground, and I suspect you will hear this from some of today's presentations, you'll learn that the current housing shortage is very personal for anyone working in this arena. It's heartbreaking for me when I read the names of hundreds of individuals, Georgians, neighbors in my county who have a housing voucher from DBHDD, but cannot use it due to the lack of available housing. Now, before I go any further, let me take a step back and tell you about DBHDD's role in housing and the individuals we serve. So DBHDD serves some of the most vulnerable individuals in our state, individuals that are uninsured, individuals receiving Medicaid, and those with the highest level of need. The Office of Supportive Housing, which I oversees programs that serve individuals with persistent psychiatric debility with a diagnosis, both through our street outreach teams, the PATH teams that I mentioned, and through the Georgia Housing Voucher Program, which was born out of the DOJ settlement with the state in 2010. GHVP is a $24 million state-funded permanent supportive housing program that targets individuals with a long-term diagnosis who are without housing or at imminent risk of homelessness, those who may be in a state hospital, exiting jail or prison, or those with a history of chronic homelessness, and those with frequent ER or inpatient visits for psychiatric reasons. It's incredibly important to underline and recognize that not everyone meets this criteria, and DBHDD housing programs are intended to be the safety net behind the safety net. serving only the most vulnerable. Most individuals experiencing homelessness rely on this homeless service system for assistance, those continuums of care around the state, which are the points of entry or access for federal resources, as well as sometimes state and locally funded resources. But whether they are pursuing DBHDD housing or continuum of care housing, this is a complicated system, especially for anyone exiting from homelessness, as well as case managers working to support individuals. And you've heard about that. As the Behavioral Health Authority for Georgia, DBHDD is an important part of this puzzle. Our service network covers all 159 counties and overlaps all of the continuums of care throughout the state. And so many individuals receiving their assistance from these COCs often may also need behavioral health services for mental health or substance use challenges. I was brought into the department in 2019 to lead a strategic transformation of the GHVP program. We have gotten more effective and much more efficient since then. We reduced the wait times for the GHVP voucher by 90%. What was once on average over 100 days as of the last quarter of last fiscal year was under 10 days. And as I mentioned earlier, many vouchers still go unused due to lack of available and affordable housing options. And even with this barrier, we've been able to employ some strategies that have helped us move the needle on circumstances that are within our control. In this past fiscal year, FY22, we increased our voucher conversion, meaning people accessing housing with their GHVP voucher, by 13%, from 37% to 50%. This is following a 22% rental increase in 2021 in Georgia. Normal rent increase is 3%. We also heard about home appreciation. That rate in Georgia is about 26%. Normally, it would be about 5%. So we should have expected a drop in our voucher conversion, but we saw the opposite, right? Why did that happen? In 2021, we designed and began investing in a housing support program to ensure that GHVP is upholding the true model of housing first, which does not mean housing only, but requires ongoing supports to promote stability, recovery, and independence in the community, allowing the state to uphold the requirements of the Olmstead Act and our settlement with the DOJ. We now have providers in 5 of 6 DBHDD regions that have been operational for almost a year, assisting individuals with their vouchers and engaging individuals who've been previously housed to ensure their stability and well-being. When someone gets a voucher, they get assigned a specialist that helps them navigate the process, which is complicated as we've discussed, and continues to visit them in their home on a monthly basis at a minimum to support their ongoing recovery and integration into the community. This looks like helping them apply for benefits, exploring employment opportunities, navigating any challenges with their landlord or neighbors, and encouraging them to engage in services that match their needs. This work has been recognized and lifted up by the National Conference of State Legislators, and we recently were invited to present to them and other national organizations. While we start out by fully funding the program with state dollars as we get implemented, the majority of these activities are indeed Medicaid billable, meaning much of its costs can be offset by billing once the full program is fully up to speed. We continue to consider ways we can increase landlord participation in our program. So we received additional state funds in the FY20 budget, and we hired a landlord relations manager who is supporting improved customer service and will ultimately support landlord recruitment and retention. DCA created a similar position in February of this year. We've also created a new landlord incentive to support case managers' ability to secure housing when helping individuals. So providers are able to offer up to $750 as a lease signing incentive to properties to mitigate administrative burdens. And we've previously created a landlord risk mitigation program that ensures up to $1,000 for any damages that may occur to mitigate the perception of risk for properties. We have to partner effectively with landlords, right? And with property management companies. I think what you will find in your conversations with others is that there is plenty of motivation to access housing and genuine effort on the part of our service systems to solve problems where we can. We have people waiting in metaphorical, sometimes literal lines for their turn, and some of those who have received a voucher are still waiting, hoping the door will open for them if a property can be identified. The individuals without homes are struggling every day to survive in conditions none of us would want to deal with. Our goal here is to find the right support to lift a person up in their moment of need, and we work hard to make sure our help is just that, helpful, that it doesn't exacerbate their symptoms, cause distrust of anyone trying to assist them later, or at its most extreme, increase feelings of hopelessness and suicidal ideation. The nation has been moving increasingly toward permanent supportive housing as a solution because the evidence shows us that indeed it does work, and the math shows us it is fundamentally more affordable for already strained public systems. This is a comparison of what it costs us to house someone and provide them supports for a year compared to what it costs other systems for them to be housed for the same amount of money. As Commissioner Nunn referenced earlier, Houston recently received national press coverage for its success in housing 25,000 individuals by using permanent supportive housing and capitalizing on private-public partnerships. And that article also cites some of Atlanta's progress as well. We have to support the construction of new units and the recruitment of existing properties. This can be done through incentives, risk mitigation programs, and through regulation that can ask and enable commercial landlords and businesses to be partners in making our communities healthier. It is correct to look at this issue and feel passionately that we can and must do better. There is work ongoing now between state and local agencies, building bridges between the homeless and behavioral health systems to better maximize limited resources and simplify navigation of a complicated process and a dizzying web of programs. By using technology to allow information sharing and care coordination, we can save time and money and connect case managers and individuals to the right resource faster and begin to take a truly statewide approach to addressing homelessness and housing instability. Before I close, I do want to make sure that this committee is aware that the state continues to be under DOJ supervision on the area of supportive housing. We are making immense progress, but if we consider a shift in approach, it should be carefully considered the impact that that may have on our settlement agreement with the DOJ. In conclusion, so we absolutely can do better, and we are in the process of achieving major advancements in Georgia. I think it's critical that we continue to invest in these evidence-based solutions that work and that we allow Georgia's expertise in our own systems to drive the transformation that we need. Thank you for your time. I'll accept any questions and do my best to answer. And I've left some high-level program data at the end of the slide deck, should you wish to review it.
Sure. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you coming in and presenting. On slide 11, when you do the housing cost comparisons.
Sure.
What does the $11,000 pay for?
So that is referring to our rental subsidies. So in combination with the cost of supports, when we look at average at an annual rate. So it's about $8,000 a year in rental subsidies, and it comes down to around $3,000 per person with those support contracts.
Okay, the support contracts now, does that cover food, utilities, all the, is it all encompassing?
No, sir. So those are the supports of someone visiting them, providing access assistance with
Right.
connection to those benefits.
Right.
So they can help them apply for SNAP, WIC or local programs
Right.
to help them navigate.
Because I know the jail and prison housing costs factor in everything from salaries of employees, utility costs, food, medical services, whether psychiatric care, standard health care, and things of that nature. So I'm just wanting to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. And of course, those individuals that you are trying to help have not been arrested or convicted of any crimes in Georgia either. Their only issue is that they are unhoused and, like you said, the greatest at risk, whether there's mental health issues or some other obstacle that has prevented them from transitioning into normal housing, whether that be a shortage of properties available or again, some type of medical issue that they have to deal with. And something that the commissioner mentioned earlier, and you may have a little bit clearer understanding on that based on the research that you've done, but using the traditional definition of homeless. Now, I'm not talking about unsheltered. I'm not talking about people sleeping on the streets, but those who are legitimately they have the vouchers, they're part of your process. What number would you say are on the outside right now in the state of Georgia? And an estimate is completely acceptable, that are struggling to find a place to live?
Sure. So a couple of things. Many of the individuals in our program have often recently exited an institution. So whether hospital, a state hospital, an ER,
Right.
and jails and prisons. So many of them do have criminal histories that create a lot of barriers when they get to the actual application process for an apartment. It doesn't prevent them from getting a voucher. That's what our voucher is there for. But so wanted to note that. And in addition, there are certainly additional living costs associated with folks living in an apartment, but just trying to look at the state dollars that we invest. With regard to the number of individuals that have our vouchers, so around 70% of the individuals that receive our voucher are folks that are qualifying on the basis of their chronic homelessness. So most of those individuals are in the community, meaning that they're currently in a situation of homelessness. Some of them may be in and out of shelters because that's not, you don't stay there long term. You can go in and out, but a large number are actively experiencing homelessness while they're getting that assistance. We do provide some supports to try to offer short-term temporary like hotel stays because someone may be in a really unsafe situation when they get met by a case manager. But yes, indeed, many of them continue to be actively homeless while they're looking for housing. And that can be, you can't see that about a person, right? That they've got a voucher.
That's right. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, number 5. And you touched on it a little bit here, just going a little deeper detail, pre-Olmstead decision versus now. Is there any middle ground that we ought to be kind of working towards on this? And I'm assuming if there was, y'all would already be doing it, but the judge and I were talking a second ago. If the state signs for housing that people move into, is that technically a violation of the Olmstead decision?
I'm not sure that I understand the question, Senator. If we signed for the housing?
Yeah, you said there were issues with, you were having to do some like insurance, for lack of a better term, from the state to the landlord to cover any damages. And then you're having some hesitancy, it sounds like from your testimony, of landlords to
Sure.
make places available. They would probably be more apt to do it with the state, but if the state paid the money, would that be a violation of the court's decision?
So I can tell you, I don't know on the legal question, and I would definitely defer to our legal experts at DBHTD. But what I can tell you is that the way that we distribute funds like that for individuals, or when we have to pay a landlord, so we're both going into an agreement with the individual and the property. So we disperse directly to the property for their rental subsidy. And that's similar to the way that housing choice voucher works. So that's certainly not a problem with Olmstead, because that's what they made the state do to create that program. But the way that we use the risk mitigation funds, those are paid out by a provider who then gets reimbursed by DBHTD. So it's still utilizing our provider network. And that's the same program that we use for startup costs for individuals. Households get up to $2,500 to deal with deposits, furniture, all the basic things that someone might need. So we haven't seen any issue with that. It's been kind of standard practice, I think.
Okay, and just to finish up, Mr. Chair, I promise it won't be much longer, more than a half hour. Y'all's agency, your department amazes me, because BH is a standalone issue. DD is a standalone issue, and y'all are trying to handle both simultaneously. Now, your presentation dealt primarily with BH is what it looked like.
Yes, sir.
And I'm afraid that we're going to see some of these as parents start aging out within the DD community. We're going to see some of that coming up a little bit stronger later on. But the only thing, and I don't need you to answer it now, but I also understand that there are meds for certain diagnoses that are longer impacting than day to day to day,
Mhm.
which I'm afraid that somebody takes pills for a while, gets gets themselves in a level environment, they're cured, they go off the meds, and we're back in the same spiral again. But if you have some of the longer ones that, and some of them I understand go 6 months to a year, they cost more. Are we looking at making that available for?
So I can't speak to the rate of use of that or whether we can get back to you on that, as you said. But I'm aware of those, long-term injectables. What I can say is that what you highlighted there is really critical, that we can't put people with a severe psychiatric disability into housing without ongoing supports. Because whether those meds run out in 1 month or 6 months, there needs to be visits and ongoing support. That person may still need clinical treatment services. They may need other medications. They may be doing well and not need medication, but they may start to just have symptoms appear at some point. And so ensuring that we have supports that check on people on a regular basis that's part of the program helps provide a safety net to identify when people are starting to be symptomatic or expressing that they're having challenges and need help. It allows them to reach out. We essentially had a problem before we implemented the program where that could happen, where individuals got into an apartment. And then if they, chose to disconnect fully from services, there may not be anyone visiting them, kind of encouraging them to continue going to their appointments, et cetera. And so that's what we're implementing now and correcting. And it's been showing positive results thus far, but we can get back to you on the first point.
Thank you, Chairman. Maxwell, thanks for your presentation. I think your point on landlords is a good one. We represent a lot of the larger business community and a number of landlords in downtown. I'm curious on the housing support program. It seems like that's led to an increase in that voucher conversion. Does that support have a time limit to it? And I guess the second part of my question is, are you all actively tracking how that support leads to better renewals? Is that individual staying with that landlord able to renew their lease versus before that support was in place?
Sure, absolutely. So on the length of the support, so that support team gets activated as soon as we approve someone for a voucher. And that's the time frame that we got down under 10 days, that approval time frame. The voucher used to be good for 60 days with the ability to extend. After seeing from data that on average it takes people 90 to 120 days, we extended it to 120 days. And that can still be considered for extension if folks are still actively looking. So that support is intended to be there ongoing with them throughout that time. And then, of course, continue once they become housed. But we have a lot of people who, as I said, are not able to convert that voucher into housing. And then they end up back in a different part of the system, likely. That cutoff also comes with connection to other potential resources and, ongoing service providers. But obviously, that is a lost opportunity, right? We've invested time and energy, and as I always note, people's hope into that solution. And so to not find it at the end of the road after working so hard is very disenchanting. As far as, because the program, we're literally coming up on a year now, we will still have to wait to see some of the longer term outcomes, but retention and stability, like long-term stability, is an important metric. So tracking how many people remain stably housed after 12 months, as well as beyond that, right? And how many people are getting transitioned over to the housing choice voucher, which is something we're able to do for individuals in the settlement population. They have a preferential waiver access. So those are really important metrics, and it is part of what we're building into our data and tracking, because it is really critical. And it's one of the typical metrics that people cite, what is your success with stability? So yeah, that's going to be an important metric for us to watch.
Two more questions, Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. They're all connected, so I'm going to give them to you all the same.
Sure.
The vouchers that you're referring to, my understanding, they're different than the ones that Commissioner Nunn spoke about this morning.
Correct.
And so do they also function differently in terms of how much money goes to the landlord? So Commissioner Nunn spoke about, it depends on earned income, and there's a whole complicated metric that tells you how much a landlord is going to receive it from that voucher. Does this voucher operate in the same way? And then can you give us a hard number? So Commissioner Nunn told us that there are currently 970 households walking around the state who have vouchers with no place to use them. How many people from D, B, D, H, D,
One of those.
so all those letters, how many are currently walking around with a voucher and no place to use it? And then finally, at what point in the application process for a housing opportunity does a landlord find out that you want to use a voucher? Does that happen early on? How far, are these people getting all their hopes up and then having them dashed against the stone when the landlord says, oh yeah, I don't take vouchers? Where is that happening in the process?
Sure. So a couple things in there. So essentially it does operate the same way in terms of calculating the value of the voucher as the HCV. The reason for that, and that was really since the program's origin, is that it has been set up to be able to transition people over to an HCV voucher. Because we have that preferential waiver access from HUD, the DCA requested and received some years ago. So if we increase over those standards, they will not be able to transition, or they will be told, well, we've got to move you and look for a cheaper unit. We do match DCA's standards. We match Atlanta Housing Authority standards, which are a little higher locally in response to increased markets. But for an individual household, that monthly rent on average is about $750. It can vary from $300 to $1,500 or more, depending on their situation. People are expected to contribute a portion of their income, but some individuals have no income, as would not be surprising. And we pay for 100%. We're working on an ability to provide some utility supports because increasingly there are no units that will include that. So regarding the process with landlords, case managers, it depends on the specific situation, but a case manager is meant to work with an individual to look for units, ensure that, they're within the range of affordable. We have, a kind of worksheet that helps calculate, all right, based on this cost, what is going to be the household's requirement? And is that affordable for you based on your income, right? We want to ensure that we're not putting people in units knowing that they can't afford the bill 2 months later, or we know they'll face eviction. So often during the process, it's quite early that landlord knows, because we also have to pay application fees when we're helping people apply. That's some of the money that comes out of that bridge funding. So they don't want to work with a property that's going to decline a voucher. So often they're confirming their willingness, because safety inspections have to occur, right? So they need to know that you're prepared to engage in this process. Some properties don't want to deal with an inspection or don't want to make changes if it's found to have a deficiency. But it certainly is the case that people frequently apply for housing and then get denied, right? And that happens to normal renters, right? Often there can be dozens of people with an application, right? And as stated, the individuals with these vouchers, they were already the most vulnerable, on the fringe of the market without economic means. So they are not a competitive consumer, and we're trying to make them competitive. But increasingly, there is a very low interest in vouchers from commercial properties, and we're seeing a decline across multiple programs, not only GHVP. Let me know if that answered the question.
Your number of how many people have a voucher with no place to use it?
Yes, so these are looking back at fiscal year data, so it's not the number of current active vouchers. That number I don't have for you off the top of my head, and that's a number that I want to be able to easily snap at. We are in the process of a digital transformation for this program so that we can actually digitize all of the forms and collaborate better with other systems. We've been analog. Much of this process occurs on paper, believe it or not, which is a nightmare for case managers and can make it hard for us to track. So we are making those changes, and some of the allocations we received last year are helping with that. So we have hundreds of individuals right now, from that number, 728 that we issued and 236 that became housed. There's several hundred people who are still currently looking for housing. Because often we do approve beyond the deadline. If they're still looking, we have no interest in taking that away. Because again, people worked, the provider worked hard and the individual worked hard, gathering all of these documents, signing everything, their personal IDs and everything. We don't actually require IDs, so we reduce barriers, but we know that at the application process for any apartment, they're going to need all of these things and expect them, or you're getting looped out of the pile quite quickly.
Just briefly, another piece of information that would be great is if we could see the geographical location of these unfulfilled vouchers too. So we could see how they're dispersed around the state, and that gives us an opportunity to look at the housing markets and availability of apartments and other things in different communities that are represented by senators, throughout the state of Georgia.
Absolutely.
But something that the majority leader asked a while ago piqued my interest. If you have an individual, say me, you get me in housing, I'm on that fringe, I'm at that at-risk population, and I'm on psychotropic medication and require, a certain amount of care. If I get in that environment and I just lock down and refuse, is there a process where I'm removed from the housing, or am I there? If I know that you require a portion, I think 30 to 40% of my income.
Right.
If I'm employed, but if I'm not employed, then y'all pay 100%.
Right.
So what do we have those situations where individuals get in because of the fragility of certain, psychological problems, that somebody gets in and just locks down, or do we have a person housed that we have zero contact with, or that we're unable to offer support for?
So it's really important that in the housing process, when folks are actively in crisis, that they receive crisis stabilization services first, right? And that's a challenge often that we have to explain, because folks coming out of a hospital situation, for example, are often not ready to immediately be put into an apartment. But it's certainly the case that there are individuals who have been housed, and because they have a long-term psychiatric disability, they can decompensate, they can become symptomatic. There may be an issue with medication, right? It could be any number, it could just be having a bad day. That's why it's really important to have people visiting them, to check on those things and to be engaging with them. They do like motivational engagement.
But there's nothing preventing us in a situation that becomes dire to do a 1013 and relocate that person somewhere where they can get the help they need during that period.
That's
Is that
correct.
right?
No,
Yeah.
there's nothing preventing. And that certainly has happened in certain situations, right? So as these teams re-engage individuals, they have encountered folks who clearly needed someone to be checking on them, and needed to be in services. And so they've encountered folks that were in that situation, were clearly in an unsafe situation in their apartment, and were not willing to, engage or open the door. And so they had to use the tools available to them with the 1013 so that person could be stabilized and ultimately return. They were able to go back to their apartment, right? And they're now engaging with that team. They're on medication. They're doing well. But that's absolutely why you need those ongoing supports. People can meaningfully recover and become stable in the community, but they can, we all continue to need support. And these are long-term conditions.
Last question, because we're getting way behind time. Judge, go.
Well, sir, thank you very much. But if I can just kind of summarize everything you've said for the senators, if in 15 seconds,
We'll give you longer than that.
if we've got, according to the commissioner, 970 people or families with vouchers who can't get housing, and you backed up what he said, basically, at $1,200 a month, we've got $1 million a month sitting on this table right here in front of these policymakers for a program that doesn't work, that isn't being used. And Dr. Bambi Hayes is over here begging for $3,000. Is that a fair statement? I mean, if they can't use it, we'll up it to $7,000. But if it can't be used, and this is the same problem with Section 8. I know landlords. I have friends who are landlords. I promise you, a lot of landlords aren't fired up about renting their property to a chronically schizophrenic person with no credit and very little or no income, even if Mr. Ruppersberg says, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. But that's what we've got. We've got $1 million a month sitting on this table on a program that doesn't work. Is that an unfair statement? And I'm not blaming you for that. You're just telling us what's going on out in the world. But is that unfair to say?
Well, I think I would agree that the market is creating a really untenable environment
Exactly.
for vouchers. When people are housed with vouchers, they're very effective, and they are
Sure.
much more cost effective. It is a challenge for landlords.
But we have to deal with the conditions that we actually have, right?
Yes, sir, that's correct. And I would say that the funds attached to a voucher for an individual with an SBMI for our voucher program are encumbered to that individual, the same as those housing choice voucher dollars, which are federal, right, and come with all kinds of requirements. So I really appreciate, the opportunity to support grassroots organizations. And one of the approaches that we took with some of the relief dollars that we got from Mental Health Block Grant was to fund case managers that are with some of our established providers, which, have state contracts, they have all of the stuff in place to deal with the administration, but dedicate those case managers to a community
Well,
organization.
what I think these guys want to do from a policy standpoint is help you reduce that number from 970 to 0. Get those people into housing. What can these guys do as lawmakers and policymakers to help you do your job? At least that's where I'm coming from. But thank you. I'm sorry. That was more than 15
It's
seconds.
okay. You did good, Joe. That was a good question.
In a courtroom, that would have been 14 seconds. Judge.
Nobody talks back to me in the court.
That's right. Exactly.
Oh, okay, guys. Will you be around, sir?
Yes, sir. I'll be here all day.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you.
Miss Catherine Marchman. Pardon me? Miss Catherine, if you don't mind, some of them asked for a restroom break. Let's take a 5-minute break if you don't mind. Please, just everybody take a minute.
Does anybody have one of these? And I can hand these out while you're going.
I don't have
Okay.
one. Thank you. Sorry.
They're good. I got 'em.
Thank you. about it, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for having me today. And thank you for really just your focus and attention on this very
Pull your
critical
mic a little
issue.
closer. It's close
Closer.
to you. It's closer to, there you go.
Got
Thank
it. Okay. I think they're pulling up my deck, but in the meantime, I will just give you a little bit of background. I'm Catherine Vassell now, got married a few months ago, so no longer Marchman.
All right.
I'm a clinical social worker by training. I've been doing this work and working with people experiencing homelessness for the last 25 years, living in shelter with families and women experiencing homelessness for several years on the west side of Atlanta. Working at Mercy Care, a behavioral healthcare program in Atlanta, running and integrating behavioral healthcare systems across 12 clinics here locally in Atlanta before coming over to this role for the last 7 years. So you've got the deck in front of you, so I'll just move to that and we'll get it up on the slide here momentarily. But just moving to the second slide, I do want to give you a little bit of context on what a continuum of care is. You've heard that word already this morning. I want to ground us a little bit in some data, and then I want to share a little bit about some of the solutions that we're focused on here today. Let's see. All right. So and Senator Robertson, you spoke about acronyms earlier. We do speak in the acronym language, and so I'm going to apologize in advance if I say an acronym that you do not know. Please stop me.
I'm the founding member of Angry American. Everybody in the room, that's AAAA.
I hear you. I am guilty of that. There is no question. And so the COC, or Continuum of Care, is actually a HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, term of art. And so it is both a funding stream that comes from the federal government to almost 400 communities around the country, specifically to fund programs for people experiencing homelessness. And they mostly fund housing interventions. They got away several years ago from funding emergency shelter and transitional housing simply because the outcomes were not there. They were not doing a good job of exiting people out of homelessness. And so they said, we are no longer going to fund things that don't work. And they stopped rubber stamping those grants. And so what HUD has said is that every community that gets that money must have what we call a lead agency or a collaborative applicant. And Partners for Home is that for the city of Atlanta. So we were stood up in 2015 through a design committee, some of whom sat, folks that are with me here today, sat on that design committee. They looked around the country at the way many other COCs are run, and they said, we can't do this alone with the public sector. We have to be able to leverage the private sector. And so they stood up a 501c3. So we are a nonprofit. We do not do direct services. However, we are on the ground, as I was in an encampment yesterday, working to get folks into housing and temporary safe, dignified bridge housing just last evening. But we work primarily through our partner agencies to do this work. So we are sort of the chief herder of the cats, if you will. We actually have several layers of accountability. We have two boards that we report to, both the governing board that's made up of representatives from DCA, DBHDD, Mr. Ruppersberg sits on that board, members of Commissioner Nunn's staff sit on that board, two city council representatives, a Fulton County commissioner, provider representation, as well as people with lived expertise sit on that board. They adopt and approve all of the policy that sort of organizes our system. They also adopt and approve the funding application that is competitive that we have to submit up to HUD annually. In addition, we have a board that oversees the health and viability of the nonprofit itself. We have many of our membership organizations, over 100 of them. We have 14 that are HUD funded specifically, and then we have about another 20 that get other funding that we'll talk about in just a minute. There are 9 in Georgia, and in addition to Atlanta, DeKalb, Fulton, Cobb, Columbus, Athens, Augusta, Savannah, the balance of state that Commissioner Nunn spoke about earlier makes up the remainder of all of the communities, and that's staffed and based out of the organization of the DCA. So as I mentioned, in addition to coordinating and trying to align the work, much of our work is focused on creating a strategic system that helps reduce and end homelessness overall. And so to that end, everything that we do is really grounded on housing first. And I think this slide does a really good job of sort of depicting for you how our system used to work, which was really sort of a housing ready approach, meaning we had we took a person experiencing homelessness and we said, you have to go through and check all these boxes before we think you're ready for housing. And what we learned through that process over many years was that there was all these fail points along the way. If I have a severe mental illness, for example, it is very difficult to get into mental health care and to get back on my medication, for example, if I don't have a roof over my head and if I don't have somebody walking me through that process. If I have an addiction issue, it's quite difficult to get sober while I'm sleeping under a bridge. And so what we learned through Housing First, which is an evidence-based practice that has a plethora of evidence that supports its efficacy, is that if I get someone into Housing First and housing becomes the foundation by which we do everything else, then the likelihood of me staying in housing, the likelihood of me returning to homelessness reduces dramatically, and the outcomes improve quite dramatically. So my reduction of drug use over time reduces, my improvement and stability of my mental health treatment improves, et cetera. And we're going to look at some of the cost savings to our public service system in just a minute. So Housing First is not just an evidence-based practice, but it's really the philosophy that we use as a system that guides all of our investments and all of the work that we do. And it's, for this reason, because of its efficacy, that we are so focused, laser focused on investing in and scaling housing solutions. Because at the end of the day, if we don't do anything else but work on housing a person who's experiencing homelessness, we will not have, in fact, ended their homelessness. And the good news is that it's actually a very cost-effective strategy. So even in comparison to someone's continued homelessness, which, we see numbers ranging across the board, across cities in terms of what that looks like. And Maxwell shared some data on that as well. Looking at sanctioned encampments, which will be a topic of discussion today. And we've looked at several camps, both on the West Coast as well as here locally in Georgia and Athens, that cost about $45,000 per tent per year to operate and run. In comparison to non-congregate shelter, which we operated during the course of COVID at the Ramada Hotel right around the corner from here, very effectively. And then in comparison to permanent housing, which are actually the things that effectively end a person's homelessness. And supportive housing is one of those evidence-based practices. And so this is the intervention that we reserve for many of the folks we've talked about today. The person who is long-term disabled with a chronic mental health issue, maybe a chronic medical issue that is never really going to resolve itself. So that individual is going to need some long-term subsidy in order to stay out of homelessness. They will pay a portion of their disability income. As we heard, about 30% of that income would go to their rent if they have that income. But they're also going to need services to stay in housing and get those supports that we've talked about already. And the good news, again, is the reduction that we've seen across many, many studies, and I've just referenced a few of them here, both nationally across the US, as well as studies internationally in Canada and in Europe. The reduction in the cost savings over time to our public service system is just remarkable. So the efficacy of these programs is really not without question. And I think some of the questions that have been raised to date is really sort of how do we continue to invest in that and scale those solutions that we know are working so well. One example of what we're doing right now is we launched a local investment fund through a $25 million bond that was done at the local level a few administrations ago. That was championed by Jack Harden, one of our board members who's here with us today, and then matched by the private sector dollar for a $50 million investment. We used about half of that money to invest in the development of supportive housing. And as you'll see, these units were our investment was $40,000 per unit to develop. Again, still very cost effective when you compare it to the interventions that prolong or manage a person's homelessness. Some of the examples of the developments that we're investing in are pictures on the left, and on the right, you'll see that we created essentially a product that creates the three-legged stool, if you will, that builds a supportive housing unit, One component of that is the capital that's required to build the unit. One component is the subsidy. We need that ongoing voucher subsidy, and that typically comes from the federal government. And that partnership came through Atlanta Housing Authority, who's our local public housing authority. And then the other component is the services, and that came through our partnership with Fulton County, who's agreed to provide the services for all 550 units that we develop. So what we learned from this product is that when we combine the financial tools that are required to build a unit of supportive housing, and we make it easy for developers to access, because we have one application process now for all three funding streams, the developers will come. And we've had developers that have come to the table and applied for these units who have never done supportive housing before. So where we're struggling to entice landlords to the table to accept a voucher, what we do know from this example is that when we make it easy and we entice them in the right way, developers will come to do this work. But I think we have to make it easy for them. We brought the subsidy, we brought the services. We didn't force them to have to go back out and scramble and figure out how to do that on their own. So as of today, we have about 500 units that are in development as we speak, some right around our community here. And then the bottom right-hand corner was a rehab of a property, an old school building that is online now. In the middle is under construction now, right down the street on Decatur Street, across from the King Memorial train station, Thrive, Sweet Auburn. And then Macaulay Park, you may have seen in the paper recently, it's a partnership with Mercy Care. So a real blend of healthcare combination with housing innovation that's being built in the old Fourth Ward. So do want to just look at some data very quickly. And I appreciate your comments, Judge McLean, around the point in time count and just how imperfect it is. And imperfect it truly is. But what I can say about the point in time count is, one, it is required by all the COCs. So all 9 COCs in Georgia have to conduct this count. And what I can say about the Atlanta point in time count is that since 2016, I started in the fall of 2015. Since 2016, we have conducted the same count using the same methodology year over year from that time. So what I can confidently tell you is we are at least comparing apples to apples. We do work really hard to do a very thorough job when it comes to our unsheltered count. So we don't just do the night count, we do multiple day shifts following the night count. In January, we're required by HUD to do it in January. And those day shifts are at homeless service locations, in encampments, with our outreach teams to try to capture people we might have missed on the night of the count. But we surely missed people on the night of the count, there is no question. But as I said, at a minimum, we know that we're comparing apples to apples. And what we like to do is use the point in time as just simply a gauge of our progress. Again, is not a perfect science. And we're using a lot of other data in real time that many of our providers are inputting on a daily basis in terms of when they're doing street outreach, encountering people on the street, they enter that data in real time into our system. So we're using real-time data as well. But from using this as a gauge, we have actually had an overall reduction in the numbers of people experiencing homelessness in the city of Atlanta. And many of you will say that is laughable. There are encampments all over the city. And many of you will say that is
Prior to that, what was
that our reduction is laughable.
okay, because I thought you said a percentage.
We have had a 38% overall reduction. Now, what I want to say is taking unsheltered, not included for the moment. If you look at our data that we report to HUD, and this data does go up to HUD and it gets scrubbed by HUD technical assistance, and we have to answer questions, and we are accountable to HUD as well for the data that we submit every single year. We pull our emergency shelter and transitional housing data from a data system that is inputted by our providers. And so that data, is entered on the night of the count by shelter providers regarding the people that are in their system. And so we know we saw a reduction in our sheltered count as well. But all that said, one other comment to this is we do recognize that there has been an increase in visibility of homelessness on our street. And we do believe that, there are a few reasons for that. One is during COVID, our downtown was really empty. There was no other person in our downtown area. And people experiencing homelessness are just like you and I. They want to be where resources are. They want to be where other human beings are. And so many people experiencing homelessness have moved to parts of our town and our city where other people are. In addition, there are a lot of great people many of whom you've heard about today, who are giving out donations of tents. Tents in and of themselves make homelessness significantly more visible in our community. So those are just a couple reasons why we think that there has been an increase in visibility. But that said, the other component of this data is that what we're looking at year over year has been an increase in the number of people who are in housing. And so I think we have to look at both when we're looking at the numbers of people in our system who are experiencing homelessness, but also the number of people that we're actually placing in housing year over year. And that number has increased due to our housing surge that I'm going to talk about in just a minute, by almost 600. Houston has done, you've heard about that through the New York Times article, a tremendous job. We look to Houston to mirror a lot of what we're doing. Since 2017, we have housed almost 6,000 households, and that reflects about 10,000 people over the last 5 years. We've looked at a little bit of statewide data through Commissioner Nunn. Just want to call out that Atlanta has about a third of the homeless population in the state of Georgia. And I want to flag two other things in terms of utilization of shelter. So for several years now, we have actually had a pretty significant underutilization of both shelter and transitional housing beds in our system. Again, this is on the night of the count, so this fluctuates quite dramatically. You can actually go on HUD's website, you can pull up our housing inventory count for the last several years. You can go project by project. And when we look at that, when we look at low barrier shelters, our low barrier shelters are actually far higher utilized than some of our high barrier shelters. And what do we mean by that? When we say low barrier, we mean a shelter that's accessible 24/7. That has limited rules and requirements to entry. So doesn't prohibit somebody with a mental illness who's not on medication from coming in, doesn't prohibit someone with active addiction from coming in. And what we see is where a shelter with low barriers has very high utilization, a shelter with high barriers has very low utilization, which is resulting in people taking to the streets as opposed to trying to access those shelters. And so one very, low-hanging fruit in terms of solutions goes, if we had 600 of our beds that are being operated in high barrier shelter, those shelters were to lower barriers today, we could arguably help solve for the majority of the people that are on our street with no additional investment today. And so there's very real opportunities right in front of us today through getting the buy-in of some of our privately operated shelters who tend to operate with much higher barriers in place. Similarly, with transitional housing, we had very low utilization at about 63%. So moving on to some of the solutions that we've been investing in to date. During COVID, there was a very clear silver lining and a very clear takeaway that we learned and that many communities, Houston being one of them, took away, which is where we invest at scale, we can create the housing solutions that we need, and we will see the continued declines that we are seeing now in our numbers. We will continue to see those in our community. So what we did with Lyft, we partnered very closely with the city of Atlanta. We leveraged $19 million in public stimulus funds from the federal government. We raised another $5.5 million, and we set about an ambitious goal to house 800 households. Oops. We created a robust infrastructure in partnership with our partner providers, outreach teams, our housing teams. We hired a unit acquisition team. So we hired the organization Open Doors, who's a nonprofit who all they do is go out and secure landlords. We did pay landlords a unit acquisition fee or an incentive fee to partner with us. And that proved to be a very viable and successful way at securing units. And we're looking to replicate that now. So we were able to secure about 600 units in short order. We hired a fiscal agent who all they do is pay the rents. And then we hired about 10 nonprofits, some of whom had never played in this space before, some of whom with much smaller operating budgets, to be able to add capacity to our system to get 800 households into housing. In addition, as a part of that work, we launched an encampment closure initiative. We worked in partnership with the State Department of Transportation, with City Atlanta Police Department, as well as the City Department of Public Works, alongside all of our outreach teams and partner providers. We closed 9 encampments, and utilizing the hotel, which was a non-congregate shelter that was incredibly low barrier, we were able to move 249 people directly out of encampments and immediately into the hotel. And of those, about 200 people were placed into permanent housing through the LIFT initiative. That resulted in about 30 acres that were cleaned, 152 tonnage of debris and trash that were collected. Again, resulted in 196 people moving from those encampments into housing. And again, we see that result of our unsheltered number, the correlation of our unsheltered number declining to accompany that. This is the status of our current LIFT initiative. 794 households were placed into housing. We are tracking the performance of that work still today. And that is reflected in the returns to homelessness number, which is at a 5% return currently. As a part of that work, we are striving to divert 1,200 households out of our system quickly with a shallow subsidy. Really helps people who don't need long-term intervention with, supports with security deposit, first month's rent, work boots, whatever they need to get out of our system quickly if they just need a little bit of assistance. And to date, we've diverted 645 households, and that work is ongoing. And 4% of those households have returned to homelessness. So again, very effective solution. And I want to add to that. Today, you can go on our website. You can see our performance dashboards for every single project that we fund. You can look at how those projects by name are doing at exiting people into housing, at preventing people from returning to homelessness, and at increasing people's income and access to public benefits. And so from an accountability and performance standpoint, I just want to call out that that is something that we're constantly tracking, and that is available publicly as well. And so the work that is now underway is what we're calling LIFT 2.0. Again, we want to scale and continue to invest in solutions that we know are working. We want to replicate what we did with LIFT 1.0. We want to double down on that effort. And our goal is to house 1,500 households to double down on the encampment work, which has already begun. You may have seen on MLK walking to the Capitol this morning, and achieve an end to housing for, again, 1,500 households over the next year and a half. To that end, we have secured both state and city stimulus dollars. We were an awardee of state American Rescue Plan dollars of $6.9 million. DCA has awarded us $5.9 million in emergency solution grant stimulus dollars, and the city is partnering up with us with another almost $8 million. We are going about leveraging these dollars to partner with several hotels. We have purchased a hotel, replicating what has successfully been done in many other communities to purchase hotel properties, use them for both immediate bridge solutions, which are incredibly dignified, offer privacy, offer a place where people can safely lock up their belongings, offer solutions for folks that are choosing, in many cases, to sleep outside as opposed to going to high barrier shelter. And as you saw from the results from the first encampment work, we had very few people that declined any option. If we were offering traditional shelter, this data likely would have been flipped on its head, where most people would have been declining. And in this work, we only had 17 declines, and we had 250 people accept access to hoteling. And I do want to call out this slide as we talked about the cost of admin. So we strive and work really hard, and our providers will tell you that we are constantly pushing back on this. We want to make sure that our dollars are spent as much as possible on housing people. And so of the $26 million that we're investing, only 4% of those dollars are being invested in administrative cost. And that is something we're incredibly proud of. The majority of these dollars are going towards permanent housing solutions. I also want to call out of our goal to house 1,500 households in this work, we still have a gap. And so there is an opportunity for continued investment at both the state, the local, and the philanthropic level. And we are going about that ambitiously now in the private sector to raise that $7 million to house the remaining 300 households as a part of this work. The key activities are the same as Lift 1.0. I won't go into detail there. Much of this work has already begun. We've procured just under 10 providers to begin this work. We're executing a contract with our unit acquisition team through Open Doors this week. Our fiscal agent is being contracted as well. And the encampment work has already begun. We closed compassionately 2 encampments yesterday. I'm going to show you that data here in just a moment. We are leasing hotel rooms as we speak, and the unit acquisition is going to begin within the next 2 weeks. The unsheltered homeless plan is a top priority of ours, as well as of this mayor's. And you're going to hear from Ms. Mitchell, who's going to talk about that a little bit as well. That is going to look very similar to what we did previously. We're going to be engaging people through outreach teams for several weeks prior to a closure. That involves building trust, rapport, assessing individuals and their needs. It involves getting them to a temporary bridge location or moving them directly from the street into permanent housing solutions. Then that is through partnership with our state partners at the Department of Transportation, our city partners in sanitation, as well as law enforcement. I didn't cite the locations of the encampments for you here publicly, but this is our schedule. We have 9 encampments, or 10 rather, that are due to be closed by the end of the year. And as I mentioned, 2 were completed yesterday. Of the 2 that were closed yesterday, 38 were moved directly into a hotel. 6 folks went to shelter. 9 people declined, or we lost sight of them, and we are still trying to find them in partnership with our outreach teams. And we will have some of those who will be diverted, and the remainder will be placed into permanent housing subsidy. Our goal is that through Lift 2.0 and the continuation of Lift 1.0, we will continue to see significant declines in our overall population. And the good news is these are strategies that can be replicated both throughout the metro area as well as statewide, and are being replicated with success nationally as well. And so with that, I want to give Kenyatta an opportunity to say a few things from the city standpoint, and would be happy to accept any questions that you may have.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to speak. I just wanted to echo, obviously, all the comments that were made earlier. These represent what the city of Atlanta is doing. I am mainly here to let y'all know that we support and have put a lot of resources to ending homelessness and ensuring that it's a very brief situation in the city of Atlanta. So I'm really just here for questions and to let y'all know that we support everything that she is doing. So, I know this is a long process. I'm trying to cut a little bit shorter for y'all.
Start with Senator Robertson, please.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. That was a lot of information to digest. But you started out talking about the cost of a tent, and I think you used around $40,000. The number I found on the West Coast is $60,000 to $65,000. Can you tell me what the cost per individual the city of Atlanta is spending right now on relocating those that you and I love buzzwords that y'all are compassionately relocating, and those others that y'all are finding housing for? What do you think the investment is per person?
Well, the Lift initiative is $23,000 per person per year investment.
Okay, now
And that's a permanent housing investment.
that's a permanent housing investment. Does that include services?
That does include services.
Okay.
Yes.
The other thing you brought up is individuals suffering from substance abuse, whether it's alcohol, heroin, or whatever, that your contention is, or your belief is that permanent housing should be first. Where in other parts of the country, what they have found, if we found John Doe living on the street suffering from alcoholism, which is the most dangerous addiction to have, and where you can, going through the withdrawal process, death is a real thing as opposed to heroin and other things, where, to be honest with you, it's not as dangerous. Why would it not be? I mean, in my mindset, and I've lived in the arena and I've been to the encampments and I've dealt with a lot of alcoholics, and others that are addicted to drugs, that put them in rehab. And then once they come out of rehab, the carrot that we gave them was, hey, once you complete this process, at the end of the road, there is going to be a place for you to live and stay and be able to transition back. So I've got some concerns about that. And funding, the LIFT program, where did that funding come from?
Sure.
And you said that was 12 million, and then investments from other areas?
So start with your second question first
Sure.
and then go back to the first.
And all of
one.
those weren't questions. I was just,
Yeah, and if
clarification.
I may, I'd like
Yeah.
to respond to that.
Sure.
So Lift One was funded, the $19 million was $11 million in the Federal Emergency Solution Grant coronavirus, but that came through the Coronavirus Relief Fund
Okay.
through the federal government. That, because the city is an entitlement grantee, they received an additional ESG award of 11 million. And then on
do you
top of
recall
that,
when that was?
when that was,
Yeah.
um,
Was that 21, 22,
that was in 2020.
2020?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So the city, made that strategic investment to use all of that money to support the LIFT initiative. And then they allocated an additional $8 million in their coronavirus relief fund that the city got directly.
And what year was that? Was that also?
That was also in 2020.
Okay, then and correct me if I'm wrong, March 14th, HUD granted the city around 10 million for to support efforts to end homelessness.
That would have been through our Continuum of Care award, and
Right,
that
and that
goes
was-
directly to our
That was
providers.
2022.
That was for the FY21 award.
Okay, I think the information I'm looking at dates it as March of 22. But then the governor's negative economic impact fund did an additional 6.8, which I think you referenced to. I think you said 6.9. You rounded up, which is reasonable. Recently, directly to Partners for Home.
That's
right?
correct.
Okay, so now are all this funding, is all of this funding being, and this, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but is it being commingled and directed into some of the same projects?
No, not at all.
Okay, so it's all separated out. And this is not part of the money that's being used with the bonds that were issued out to develop the housing.
Nope,
And
not
then
at all.
developers being brought in.
No.
Exactly. So we have this huge pile of money. And it's addressing this. And what is your estimate of the size of the population that y'all are addressing in Atlanta? Those that are sheltered, which is not my understanding was not the primary purpose of the meeting today. My understanding was the primary purpose was dealing with the unsheltered, and you did speak to that. But what size of population are these groups that you represent, the city of Atlanta and the group yourself? What size population are y'all tackling?
Well, we are tasked and charged with serving everyone experiencing homelessness in
That's
our community.
that's exactly right. So
Right.
what is that number?
We use our point in time number. So at any given time, there are, anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 people experiencing
Okay.
homelessness in the city of Atlanta proper.
Correct. Okay, so we're talking about 3,000 individuals experiencing homelessness, and you're talking about unsheltered and sheltered. And I appreciate you bringing up the shelter side, the low barrier, high barrier. Does the city of Atlanta own any shelter beds?
The city of Atlanta does not own shelter beds. No.
Okay, great. And so are all the shelter beds you deal with, or are those privately owned shelter beds?
Some of them are privately owned and funded, and some of them are privately owned and publicly funded.
Okay.
And some of them have
What is,
funding streams
give me
from
an
both.
example of privately owned and public funded here in Atlanta, if you would.
the Salvation Army, for
Okay.
example, Gateway.
And Salvation Army is
Well, and
publicly
Gateway,
funded.
excuse me.
Salvation Army is publicly funded through federal, state, and local dollars.
Salvation Army gets federal entitlement dollars, and I believe, although I haven't looked at their revenue streams recently, they get private money as well.
And they are a high barrier
They are low barrier.
They're low barrier. So substance abuse and other things, they take them in 24/7, 7 days a week, very open process.
I can't speak to their exact
Right.
requirements. They are equal access, and they have lower barrier requirements. I don't know if they do entry 24/7, which
Right.
is our sort of gold standard that we would ideally look
Absolutely.
for.
I think it needs to be if
Yeah.
we're really going to address the problem.
Absolutely.
So do you know how many shelter beds, high barrier and low barrier, there are in the city of Atlanta, as we'll call it?
I don't have the number off the top of my head. We have that data and I could provide that to you after.
But there is a standard, correct? Or the courts have recognized, not courts with jurisdiction over our part of the country, but I think the Ninth Circuit, in a case that is not applicable here in the state of Georgia, they did establish a number based, and I think the federal government has established a number. And one of the cases out of the ninth, which was decided by a 3-judge panel, impacted the fact that you could not prevent people from sleeping on public property if the state or the city, excuse me, does not have enough beds based on the population per capita within that community. So
That is
I
correct.
think that's a good number when we start talking about high barrier and low barrier, to have an understanding of, because from the way you're talking, and I'm gonna tell you what, the numbers you put the 38% number, and I didn't laugh at all. I think that y'all have been going hard at this problem. And so I'm not shocked by a 38% reduction number. But if that's the case, then I would hope that some of the available shelter beds are still available for the others. Like when I drove in this morning and the individuals around the church, I noticed y'all have done a good job of clearing them out in front of City Hall, but around the other 3 sides of the building, when I walked through, they were there. And so, you know, and I can understand if some of those are ones that don't want to go to a bed. So I was just curious. I'd like to know that, if you could let me know how many beds there are in Atlanta and how many are available.
Absolutely.
High
We can-
barrier and low barrier.
We can provide that too. Yeah. And just going back to your point on addiction. So we, we strongly believe that anyone who is ready to go into residential treatment should go that direction. And we, our teams are adept at getting folks into treatment. I think there is a availability and capacity issue for people who are uninsured and don't have access to long-term, addiction treatment. But that, if you're not ready for treatment per se, that shouldn't preclude you from housing either. And we would use a harm reduction approach in working with that individual, and things like motivational interviewing that are also evidence-based, in getting that person to the place where they are ready to go to treatment. And if they were, then we would work with them to get them into treatment. But I
Right.
fully
And-
agree with
and-
you.
And there may be a possibility to encourage a little more funding over on the addiction side.
Absolutely.
And with the success y'all have had of pulling in this much funding, because I've worked in very large buildings with very high populations of addicted individuals, and these individuals didn't have the ability to come and go as they pleased. But I've also been in places where people with addictions were in hotels, motels, and other places that I would not allow most humans to walk through, because what we've done is we've took individuals with serious diseases and we've consolidated them in tight spaces. And that is not a very conducive environment, not only for the average citizen, but for those who are providing services. And in some cases, it's a very dangerous place for public safety to go.
Mhm.
So I think having a risk management process that is supported by the medical community,
Absolutely.
not by government bureaucrats, would be strongly encouraged.
Absolutely. We had licensed paramedics who were helping operate our non-congregate shelter, and they were a phenomenal group that really helped run the shelter very effectively and safely. We also had Mercy Care on site with our mobile coach several times a week, where they were offering primary care as well as behavioral health care to individuals. We had on-site substance abuse groups for people who were looking for recovery as well. And so there is a roadmap for how to do this well.
I'm a CIT trained law enforcement officer, but I would always lean to an addictionologist before I would use my own
Sure.
training to try to determine the danger that somebody's in. I've had the sad experience to watch alcoholics and others die because they did not want help.
Right.
And so, and I was certainly not equipped to be the one to lead them to the light.
Right.
So, thank you.
I
The
did
money
wanna-
you spoke of earlier, I'm sorry.
I did want to say a few things about the areas being cleaned up by the city of Atlanta. So everything in Atlanta is not necessarily city of Atlanta property. We have to work with GDOT and other entities who actually own those properties. When it comes to churches and such, we have to do the same thing. So we were able to clean up. We worked with the state of Georgia to clean up the state of Georgia right away. That was in front of City Hall. But the area across, which is cleaned up now, we had to work with the churches who own that property. So we can't just go onto people's private property or go onto the state's property.
The churches don't own the sidewalk.
Well, right. They're on the church property.
This was sidewalk. I was walking through this.
So now all of that has been cleaned off, but I'm talking about on the church property, we can't go onto the church property,
Ma'am,
but on
you
the sidewalk,
The government cannot go onto any private.
Right.
property without.
no, right,
no,
yeah,
right.
yeah. So, but the sidewalks, if you walk down the sidewalks, they have been cleaned and we put in architecture that allows it to stay that way. So there are barriers so that people can no longer pitch tents on those sidewalks. So, if you walk down Martin Luther King, you'll see that that's not an issue.
And that was my reference to the compassionate relocation.
That is the compassionate
When
relocation.
you go in, and I do not disagree with
Mhm.
what you're doing. But what concerns me are semantics. When
Oh.
we talk about compassionate relocation, that means that compassionate relocation is we took a park bench that somebody used to sleep on and we've added armrests to it now so that 3 people that it was designed for can sit on it, thereby preventing someone from laying down and sleeping on it. We can call it compassionate relocation. But what we've done is we've made the area unattractive. I do not disagree with that at all. What I do disagree with is, let's don't make something sound all pretty sunshine, rainbows and unicorns when actually we're out there having to make really hard decisions and doing things. And we're doing all these things with millions and millions and
Yeah.
millions of taxpayer dollars. People who aren't streamlining this or watching this meeting today because they're at work.
Mhm.
And so that was my thing. Let's just be honest and frank and discuss this and find a solution. So, but I appreciate the work y'all have done.
Yeah, and I think the difference is that people have heard about us throwing away people's personal belongings, which is why we utilize that term, that we're not doing those things. So to differentiate between us just taking a dumpster out there and throwing away social security cards and all this personal.
Yeah, we used to check
information.
all of the property and evidence in large bags and.
Right.
It was their property, government had no right to take it. Or I'd be standing in front of that gentleman over there explaining why I allowed somebody's valuables to be thrown away.
Yeah,
We tagged it, put them in, and when they got back where they could, they would go and pick up all of their property.
Yeah.
Some of it, I don't know why they loved it, but they
But-
loved it.
yeah. So that's a semantic difference. That's the only reason why.
One quick question. I know Senator Jackson had one. The monies you all just received, the roughly $17 million that came in 2022 recently. Does that just go for the city of Atlanta area?
So I'd like to, and thank you for that clarification. So the 10 million that comes from Continuum of Care from HUD funding, those fund existing supportive housing programs. And that money is what we apply for year over year. Some of that is a little bit of new money. It's whatever Congress approves that allows HUD to issue some additional funds that we can apply for and compete for. But that 10 million funds 14 agencies, 3 keys, some of our supportive housing program, all of our supportive housing programs, and provides an ongoing subsidy. So most of those individuals stay in housing and then they're supported in that housing because they have that long-term disability.
Now, that would be just a first round. You'll get more funding there, right?
Well, it comes year over year, but we have to compete for it. It again, and that's why, that's what I was saying earlier. We have to apply, we submit a large grant to HUD. We have to show how each funded agency is performing. And there's a risk of losing that money if they're not performing well. So we've had, and you can actually go on our website today, all of that information is made public. The whole application process, the priority listing, who gets what. And we have had agencies lose funding due to poor performance. So, that money is accountable to HUD and it competes against every other COC in the country. So we are beholden to HUD to say how we're doing as a whole system and how these funded agencies are doing. And we have to show the performance metrics in order to get that money.
I guess what Judge asked earlier, one of the questions to Dr. Hayes, what we're talking about, Bambi or Dr. Bambi Brown, that you couldn't help her with her $3,000 she needs to make her center work. I mean, you can't go out of the city of Atlanta with that money. You can't help another organization.
Well, that COC funding, no, that funding is specifically for agencies that are providing permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing. Now, if that agency wants to apply, we are always looking for new applicants, and the application actually just opened. So there's an opportunity for new partners to come and apply. Now, as far as the city money that came with stimulus funds, that is funding an initiative to house people. And there were not smaller grants that were made available for shower programs or food programs. The goal of our work, and this is different from other private philanthropy or, other funders, is to strategically align every single dollar that we have to house as many people as we possibly can. Now we are actually looking to create a fund that will support small nonprofits that are doing work on the ground, like what Dr. Hayes described, and would fund some of that work. And we're actually looking to deploy some of those funds over the next coming months. So there will be some opportunity to be able to fund some initiatives like that.
Senator Jackson.
I can't reach it, sorry.
You're anonymous now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would like to have some clarity. During your presentation, you said, so there are some solutions. There are some things that are working. We've heard a lot of talk about how you're able to leverage federal dollars in order to do a lot of this work. What can we on a state level specifically? So as policymakers who make policy for the state, what solutions might you offer or recommend to us for us to look into on the state level that involves state dollars or state policy?
So I think one is aligning every state dollar strategically to start with. To the extent that there are state dollars paying for vouchers, making sure that those vouchers are paying competitive market rate rents so that we can compete with other market forces, and maybe even above that in some cases. So to the judge's point earlier, we don't have 600 to 700 people actively searching for vouchers and $1 million going unspent year over year. We have to get competitive with the market. So I think freeing up, to the extent that you're able, some of these state funded housing opportunities, to give them the nimbleness and flexibility that they need to be able to compete with the market. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, and just saying a couple other opportunities. The State Housing Trust Fund, is a $3 million fund that is really the only state investment in homelessness statewide. And it's been flat for almost 25 years. I think, and so one is looking at how those investments are currently being made. Are they being invested at a strategic level to scale housing interventions? And are they structured and funded in a way that actually enables providers to do that well? And I think you're going to hear from some providers that can provide a little bit more detail on that today. But I think the funding issue is very real. We saw where through COVID, both in Atlanta and then in so many other communities around the country, and if I really encourage you to take the time to read that Houston article, where we invested at scale, we're able to create the amount of housing placements that we need to continue to see impact. And so, the state has invested at a very minimal level, to be honest, for many, many years. We don't have any dedicated revenue in Georgia for homelessness at all. And so I think there is a very real opportunity, one, to invest, dollars that are coming, surplus dollars that we're fortunate enough to have right now at the state level, and stimulus dollars that have yet to be allocated in a strategic way. And I think there's opportunity to look at dedicated revenue for homelessness, both, across the state. There's also an opportunity to look at existing dollars that come in from the federal government, those entitlement dollars that go to entitlements, to see how are we strategically allocating them currently. to housing rather than sort of sprinkling them around or spreading that money around like peanut butter at sort of multiple solutions in very small increments.
Okay, guys, we're gonna have to. You sure? Yeah, if you don't mind, if you guys would hang around, we got to get
Absolutely.
about 2 more in before our lunch break. If you don't mind, thank you
Sure,
for your.
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Get y'all back up at around 10 p.m. tonight.
Yeah, about 10, 11, something like that. Judge Glock, please. And if you don't mind, Judge, I'm gonna say, when I dropped that bill that we're all discussing now, back last year, Judge from the Cicero Institute brought a world of information in from other states. And I want you to know how much I appreciate your coming this far today to testify with us and work with us. Thank you again.
Of course, Senator, and thank you, Senator, members of the committee. And I'd also like to thank, of course, all of the people here who've come to testify and the many people here working on the ground to deal with homelessness. I'm sure we're going to have some disagreements, but I do hope that we all know we're here for the same reason. We care about the homeless and we're all here for good faith. And I know that's true of the people who've testified so far. But I do want to point out a bit of some of those disagreements that I think are important and explain why we have seen what even Commissioner Nunn noted was substantial increases in homelessness over the past 3 years in Georgia. And I want to explain a little bit about the distinction that we've already discussed between sheltered and unsheltered homelessness. Now, the majority of people that are homeless in America are sheltered. The data on this is hard to find, but we know that most of them actually return to housing and only stay in shelters for about 2 months. These are people that actually need a short-term helping hand. They need a little support and they need a little assistance to move to the next stage of their lives. But it is important that what we know about the unsheltered population is distinct. We have about 220,000 unsheltered people in America right now. And according to a recent UCLA study, 75% have a severe mental illness, 75% have a severe drug or alcohol addiction. The majority have both. This, of course, confirms most of what people who work with the unsheltered understand. I once asked a homeless outreach worker in San Antonio, he said, what percent of the people you work with have one of these two problems? And he said, conservatively, around 100%. I mean, it's not absolutely I don't want to claim it's always absolutely everyone. We know these are the two overwhelming issues facing the unsheltered homeless. And if we're not dealing with these issues, we're not going to solve the problem and we're not going to help them move on with their lives. So there's been a lot of talk about housing first. And just to clarify what that means and housing first or permanent supportive housing means, the idea is, as some of the testimony has already stated, we will create low barriers to make sure that people can get into housing, and then we will see what sort of services we can provide and how they can get their lives together. About 10 or 15 years ago, we had a lot of people across the country, then Mayor Gavin Newsom of San Francisco and another mayor say, we can solve homelessness in 10 years if we institute housing first. We ran the experiment. We've actually built over 200,000 more permanent supportive housing beds. And yet since 2013, we've seen an increase in unsheltered homeless on the street. Why is this? Why have we built so many of these permanent free or heavily subsidized beds and yet still see increases in unsheltered? Well, one of the reasons is there was a Journal of Housing Economics study that showed for those cities that built a lot of permanent supportive housing beds, it took about 10 beds to get a sole individual off the street. And even that effect faded over time. Why is that? Well, of course, many of those people who were then put in permanent housing would have returned to housing unsubsidized on their own eventually anyway. And of course, the ability to ask for free or heavily subsidized housing attracted more people into the system. We know on a national level, it doesn't need to work. We know many cities such as San Francisco, many states such as Arizona have built enough permanent supportive housing beds for every single unsheltered person since they've started the program 10 to 15 years ago, and yet have only seen increases in unsheltered homelessness. Now, advocates can say, well, if they only did 10 times that amount or 100 times that amount, maybe we would solve that. But then obviously we have some sort of question about where the best use of resources and what can we actually help the homeless do with the existing resources we have. Now, what does, besides potentially getting someone off the street, what does a permanent supportive housing or housing first unit do? You've heard lots of testimony that, quote, there is abundant studies that Housing first saves money and improves health outcomes. There is dueling studies, I will say, but thankfully we have something called the National Academy of Science, the most respected scientific body in America, and they do what's called a meta study, where they look across all of the different studies on this subject. And what they found was, quote, there's no substantial published evidence that permanent supportive housing improves health outcomes. They also said there is no substantial evidence that housing first or permanent supportive housing has cost savings. Well, why would that happen? Why would giving someone potentially a heavily subsidized house not improve health outcomes? Well, one, if you're dealing someone with mental illness or severe drug addiction, you're having two issues. One, it can be isolating for those people. And we've mentioned some good documentaries. The doctor earlier mentioned, I also recommend Right to Fail, about the trouble of moving severely mentally ill people into apartments. People were then allowed to leave these apartments, descend into chaos, sometimes setting up tents in the apartments themselves, because they didn't have sort of the required treatment necessary. Because the very idea was that low barrier means we cannot ask people to do anything once they're in an apartment. That can be very dangerous for someone who has severe drug addiction or has severe mental illness. We also know that there's been decades of research into what's called the check effect. People who study addiction know that providing substantial more income to a drug or alcohol addict will lead to more drug or alcohol abuse. This is common sense, and it's also backed up by evidence. So if we are merely giving no requirements for treatment, and we are giving people substantial subsidies when they're in the midst of these certain chaotic conditions, of course, we're not going to improve health outcomes. And there's been some good evidence, such as a study by the Journal of Dual Diagnosis, that people put in PSH actually tend to use more drugs and have more drug abuse problems than those left on the streets. And I will add, recently there was just a completion of a Denver, what's called a randomized control trial, where they randomly put people in permanent supportive housing or did not do any substantial intervention for them. And they found about 12% of the people in those permanent supportive housing units died in 3 years. The study tried to put the best face on this by saying, well, they had a very positive outcome for the, quote, lived participants, which doesn't seem like a very positive outcome for me, especially because the amount that died was 30% higher than those not given PSH units. And the last thing I think I'll say on the health outcomes is the current model of how we award housing is very destructive, I think, for the homeless and very destructive for those trying to get their lives back together. I'm not sure exactly what the Atlanta or some of the different state or city continuums of care use to allocate housing, but most across the United States use something called the VI SPDAT. Unfortunate name, but there it is. The general goal is to see people who are most in need of housing. But how does most cities and most states across America evaluate that need? By literally asking people how often they abuse drugs and how many crimes they commit. I'll read from the VI SPDAT system. You get extra points towards, quote, for your subsidized housing if you, quote, 1 point for running drugs for someone. Another point if a drug abuse has gotten you evicted from an apartment. A bonus point is if they've sold medication to other people. A bonus point if you've been charged with a crime or you spent a day in jail or in prison. For families, there's a bonus point if you've had a child taken away by Child Protective Services. Now, I understand they're trying to have the most vulnerable people, but what are you doing to the homeless community? We're telling them the way to get into housing is to make sure you abuse as many drugs as possible and commit crimes. This is not possibly the way to get their lives back together. I accompanied an individual over to the Austin Downtown Community Court. And when they told him he couldn't get housing, he joked, well, if only I had been a drug addict. And the social work there said, well, our thing takes many different factors into account, but yes, that might have made the difference. That is not what we should be encouraging people to do. Thankfully, there are, as the Senator Robertson mentioned, lots of programs that do provide the attachment of housing with the incentive of housing with the requirement to get clean. In 2018, the Bipartisan Support Act gave more funding to sobriety houses, groups like Oxford House that attach housing to the requirement of sobriety and work. And you've seen phenomenal outcomes among those. The idea that merely giving someone a free house and hoping someone in that condition will get better is farcical. And we know this from the time and time again. We've done this, besides the fact that it doesn't even seem to permanently remove people off the streets. And let's be clear too, when we say low barrier, the housing or shelter, The one thing we mean by that, overwhelming, not the only thing, but the most important thing, means the ability to do drugs and not be sober. And if we say we absolutely have to provide people who want to do drugs or not be sober on the street, and we need to provide them low barrier shelter so they can do it inside, that can't be something that the taxpayers or anybody who cares about the homeless should want to do. The last thing I'll say about Housing First in general is that many of the advocates do point to what they call high retention rates. How many people stay in these units once you put them in? Even if it's hard to say we cannot get substantial number of people in the city to change from permanent supportive housing or nationally permanent supportive housing seem reduced, they say, well, at least if you put someone in a housing unit, they stay there. According to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, quote, it's 91% to 75% stay in a unit over 1 year. To me, that seems like an atrocious outcome. If you give someone a heavily subsidized house and you have 25% who can't be kept inside in 1 year, then clearly you are not dealing with substantial problems that person are facing, especially when you add on this in Denver, when they did this experiment, I said, it was only 68% remained after 3 years. But as I mentioned, that is because a large number of the people in the units actually died while they were inside. This is not something that's going to be humane, and expanding more permanent supportive housing is clearly not going to help the individuals, and it's not going to help the cities that do this. Now, I'd like to talk briefly, if I may, if I have a few moments. I know the committee has been very generous just about the camping. Almost every city in America, of course, refuses to allow people to camp, sleep, and park in public places. You cannot have a city where you allow people to set up camps or sleep wherever they choose. It's a basic assumption of urban living that we all need to share public spaces together. And this is not a fringe idea that you need to, quote, force people to move out of these into somewhere else. If we have 50% of shelter beds in Atlanta that aren't being used, it is much more humane to cause someone to say, we have to move you from a park or into the street into that shelter, even if it's, quote, high barrier, rather than allowing you to slowly die out on the streets. And we do know that that is what happens when people stay on the streets. If you have these rates of mental illness and substance use among the unsheltered, what you're going to see is something like Los Angeles, where over the past 8 years, they've reduced the enforcement of street camping and its laws and street sleeping rules. They had about 500 homeless deaths a year in 2014. They now have 2,000. They're picking up 5 homeless individuals a day who are dying out on the streets and in shelters. That is clearly not a humane system. And most Americans everywhere understand that. In recent years, in popular votes in San Francisco, in Austin, Texas, my hometown, and in Denver, overwhelming majorities of very liberal, very open cosmopolitan cities have voted to ban camping because, of course, they understand this is common sense both for the cities and for the homeless themselves. It is dangerous to leave people out in the camps. And when cities have repealed camping bans or allowed the increase in camping, what have we seen? In Austin, Texas, 1 year after they repealed explicitly a camping ban, you saw a 45% increase in people in the streets. And some people said, well, they're just more visible. But you saw a 20% decrease in the number of people in the shelters. And what else happened? You saw a third increase in homeless deaths. You saw a double-digit increase against violence of the homeless. Because, of course, allowing mentally ill people or people with substance use to camp out in public without supervision is clearly inevitably going to lead to that individual's death or putting them in jail. The idea, of course, we do not want to criminalize homeless. You should always provide alternatives. But the idea that is, quote, more humane and it would be cruel to move someone who's in that condition from a park or a street into almost any better condition seems strange to me, especially know that individual will inevitably end up dead or in jail if you don't do something about it. So with that, thank you. Just I could also talk more about like some Georgia specific issues. Obviously, I just wanted to do a big, broad national thing. But if anyone had particular questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
See here, you're 6. Sarah Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Glock, for being here. I just want some clarity. You explained in great depth why permanent supportive housing, in your opinion, is not successful and not the solution. And then you also explained in great depth why nobody, I don't know anyone here who actually wants people having to sleep outside, right? But if permanent supportive housing is not a solution and people sleeping outside is not a solution, And we know because Senator Robertson just told us about the number of people who have the disease of addiction, right? And some of whom they're not going to get care right now.
Mhm.
Where are you suggesting that those people live?
Well, I mean, for one, I would certainly suggest the about 50% of unused shelter beds right now in Atlanta. If there's unused shelter beds or other places, well, of course, we should move people there. I've also advocated in other places, if there's not an alternative, if you don't have a place, sanctioned encampments, you've seen the very high numbers of what that's cost elsewhere, but I'm sure Judge McClain and some others say that is not typical of where they do. I have a sanctioned encampment down the street from me that I've been to many times, run by a wonderful group, the Other Ones Foundation, made of formerly homeless individuals, that besides the service themselves spends very little on any of the infrastructure of the sanctioned encampment. Those costs you're seeing that are very high, and I wouldn't certainly defend San Francisco's ability to control costs in any of these sort of issues, but what you're seeing are a lot of the services that are add on to that. That is obviously not the idea of a tent itself or some place to camp, or just basic public security. Why we would allow someone to say an unsanctioned encampment on the street versus a place with potable water, sanitation, and services seems to be a little strange to me, but even more strange, especially when we have open shelter beds that we should move people to.
Right. But my question is really specifically around people who cannot meet the requirements for high barrier. And I just want to make a clear distinction. There is a difference between a low barrier shelter and a no barrier shelter. I want to make that really clear. And the additional thing I want to say is that I do not know of a single shelter in the city of Atlanta in which people are being brought inside in order to do their drugs. In fact, many of them, all of them, have very clear rules around drugs and alcohol inside. So we do not have no barrier shelters in Atlanta. We have low barrier. But my question for you is, how do we get care? How do we get shelter for people who cannot meet the high barrier shelter requirements that we have throughout the city of Atlanta? Where do they go? How do they get care?
I want to know, thank you for the clarification. And I would clarify that most of the congregate shelters you talk about, I don't know specifically everyone in Atlanta, usually do have those sobriety requirements. Some of the new non-congregate shelters that have been put up don't have basically any of these requirements. And of course, nobody is ordering anybody to do drugs. You say that what do we do with the people who, quote, can't meet the high barrier shelter requirements? And to me, unless there's something that I'm not aware of in those shelter requirements that's preventing a homeless individual from living there with some basic requirements for safety and security and maybe sobriety, I don't see absolutely any reason why we should leave that individual on the street as opposed to the shelter. That does mean, quote, requiring them to move away. But that seems like a net positive. If you've ever been with someone who's looking for, say, a cousin or a brother who's drug addicted and out on the streets of a major city, and the only time they can find that person is when they've actually been pushed into a shelter or, God forbid, been arrested, I think it would obviously be much better for that person to be almost anywhere than on the streets. And that's what we're talking about. Should we allow someone to be on the streets, or should we push? Yes, it's a forceful thing, but someone in that condition, should we force them into a better position? We have those positions, and I always also support creating more of them if we need them.
Yeah. So just to be clear also about a high barrier shelter. So some of the high barriers, when we talk about high barrier shelter, is something like having to have an ID. In this state of Georgia, it can take 3 months for a person to get an ID just based on having to get the documentation required. If you were born, God forbid, if you were born in New York and you have to wait for your birth certificate to arrive here in Georgia before you can get an ID, you could be waiting for 6 to 8 weeks just for that birth certificate. So that, I mean, we call that a high barrier, but it's as simple as a ID. So I, again, want to understand, where are people who don't have an ID? Where are they supposed to go in the meantime? And then could you expound a little bit on, when you say we can force them into shelter, what does that mean? Are we talking about using my brother over here in law enforcement to make them be in a shelter? When you say force, what exactly are you envisioning for these folks who are already the most vulnerable among us?
Thank you, Senator. So on the first question, if there are unnecessary barriers being put in the way of people getting to shelter, Why don't we remove those barriers? That seems like a very simple issue. If there are shelters that are unnecessarily requiring ID, instead of saying, well, we have to leave that shelter bed empty, then, well, let's remove those requirements. I'm not sure exactly. Yeah, we're on the same. And of course, I very much support more effort to help people get identification. It's a lot of the very good work a lot of these providers are doing out here to help people get those papers. So that's very necessary. But that would be the first and obvious step. If there are those sort of barriers that are preventing people from being inside, get rid of those. I'm okay. I obviously support that. Now, on the second area, what would it look like? When we've seen cities enforce camping bans, as Senator Summers said earlier, the result of this is not criminalization or mass arrest. My home city of Austin, after they've instituted the camping ban, since of May of last year, they've moved hundreds of more people into shelters and into housing. They have not had a single recorded arrest. This is actually fairly typical for most of these places to do. You need a penalty. And some of the states I've worked in, they usually have some combination of a warning, a required referral to services or alternatives, and only then an arrest. And what that means is the combination of a warning and a referral means that there's zero or very few arrests resulting because people understand the consequences. But you need that consequence. The cities that actually enforce that, they say there is a criminal penalty at the end of the road. But what that actually results in is people moving into those better situations, not mass arrests.
One final question, if I may. So we had our commissioners and representatives from our offices talk about people, Georgians, real Georgians who live here, who just need additional support throughout the rest of their lives. They are living with some type of chronic mental illness or health condition. Maybe they were born developmentally delayed, but there are people who simply need support. You do not believe in permanent supportive housing. So what do you recommend for those types of folks who just are not going to be able to live and thrive on their own without having someone who's going to come from DBDHH, DD, all those words, to check on them every month, to make sure that they are compliant with their medication, to maybe give them the injectable that will last for 6 months? What are you recommending for those Georgians, our constituents, who absolutely need permanent supportive housing because they can't do it on their own?
Well, thank you. Now, and I would clarify that I'm not saying that permanent supportive housing is absolutely wrong for every single individual. I'm saying as a policy that's being imposed, and being imposed, as other testimony has stated, as a national and sole strategy focus, it clearly doesn't seem to work. There is a select number of individuals that need that. But I would say, and one of the things I've advocated for is increase in assisted outpatient treatment requirements and even more inpatient beds for those who have severe mental illnesses. I know there's issues with the Olmstead decree and so forth on that, but there is a place for people who need permanent support, and people do need that. But to me, I don't understand why you can't tie that with requirements to take medication or to improve. The idea that we give someone a house and then require nothing from them, which again, the federal standards right now say you aren't even allowed to set goals for people in the housing. That doesn't seem to be that doesn't seem to be a positive outcome for someone with the quote severe mental illness. The permanent housing with mandated treatment seems to me a better combination.
Judge, you are number 2.
So I want to give you another quote, and it's meant gently to you and Ms. Vassal. A pox on both of your houses. Romeo's dying words to the houses of Montague and Capulet. What frustrates me with this entire debate is the notion that one group is being pitted against another. And one group has all the answers and the other group has none of the answers. And all of our answers are correct and all of yours are wrong. Because that's simply not true. There's a lot of good things about what is happening at Partners for Home. There's a lot of good things that the Housing First model is accomplishing. And what we need to be doing is thinking about the fact that, believe it or not, the city of Atlanta is not the entire state of Georgia.
Right. Thank you.
There's 159 counties in this state, and they're different, but they all have homeless people. And Partners for Home is not in those counties. But if it's gonna go to those counties, it's gonna cost $250 million a year by the figures that I've heard. If it's $23,000 per person per year, and it's 11,000 on our point in time count, that's just math. And I heard the word permanent. I don't know, is there a legislative definition for the word permanent that I'm not understanding? But to me, speaking in plain old Douglas County English, permanent means permanent. So that means an investment of $250 million a year. If this is the only thing to do, when I get home, I'm going to send a donation to Miss Vassar. Because I think what she and her team are doing is great. What I'm trying to do on this committee is simply point out that there isn't just one answer. And if we're going to get pulled into a debate between housing folks of we know everything and they don't, instead of look for many answers. And I'm going to quote Mao Zedong, let 100 flowers bloom. I mean, there are many answers. Let's look for all the answers and answers that fit individual and unique communities. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, Judge McLean. Thank you. And thank you for that. I did start off my testimony, and I should definitely, in fact, reemphasize it with my, personal sense of gratitude and just my very impressive.
For example, if somebody wants to know how you spend less than $45,000 a year on a tent, I can tell you it costs $138.03. There's just other ways to do things.
Exactly. And just if I may briefly, Judge, thank you. The Partners for Home and the other, some of the other people we've heard from and will hear from are doing incredible work. And I don't want to disparage that in any way. As I said, we have differences of opinion about the best way to do outcomes. And a lot of this will be kind of on the margin. We all agree some people need shelter. There's some need for permanent housing. There's some need for enforcement. There's some need for all of these things. We're disagreeing about the balance.
And there's some people who can go into transitional housing and you can help them get on their feet and get them into their own housing that doesn't have to be paid for by somebody $250 million a year. They're adults, they're intelligent. You help them with their issues, you get them back going. Is that not true?
Well, exactly. And I think that's what I'm trying to advocate for. The current model in many places and nationally is that we should have only one model, which is the housing first model. And like you, I think there's actually places for all of these things. And I think we need to take them and see which is most appropriate. If we're giving every single person a permanent supportive house, we know actually a large number of people find housing that would have found it without giving that house. And we know that even when giving that, many people tend to leave it. So exactly, we need a variety of outcomes. The people on the ground here are doing fantastic work, and we're disagreeing about how best to use those resources. And ideally, like you, I think that means a fair number of different methods, not one method. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge. Before I call on Senator Dugan, one thing you might emphasize is when we wrote that original bill, we dropped that original bill, we were talking about that $100 tent the judge was just speaking about, utilizing in some of these empty parking lots around the city of Atlanta so that people have a safe and secure place to go and spend the night, not be on the street, and they have a bathroom facility. It'll be very cheap to bring in a portable bathroom facility. That was one of our main intents to cover what you're saying, Judge, in regards to that tent at $100 and something. And there's other ways of doing it.
And I just add that the city of Oakland did a study of sanctioned encampments across the country and found many ones where the infrastructure cost was about $100 to $200 per capita per year. So that is possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't want to pox on any of y'all's houses because at the end of the day, y'all aren't making the decisions. We are.
That's right.
And we're going to take a little bit of yours, a little bit of this one, a little bit of that one, and
try to put it together.
The mindset that you see at this committee is going to meld those into a product that we see has the greatest impact to the most number of people across the entire state of Georgia. So I don't need any one of y'all to give me the answer, because honestly, you don't have it. I need you to give me what the elephant looks like where you're touching it, so we can put that image all together. So before we get extremely passionate about all this, let's remember why we're here and what it is we're trying to achieve for Georgians.
Thank you for that emphasis too. Again, I can't emphasize enough that everyone has different experiences with this and everyone's bringing their own to the table. And I very much respect and know everyone's doing it in good faith. And I hope I see the committee is handling in that perspective, and I appreciate it.
This, Mr. Glock, right? Yeah, I keep.
Not a judge. I apologize.
I
Constant
re-
source of confusion for the real judges out
I
there.
remember that.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, honestly, sometimes it's better to have a legal name as judge than a elected or appointed name as judge. You were talking about sanctioned encampments, and in one of the communities I represent, there is and I'm on to air quote sanctioned. It is common knowledge. It's there. It is populated probably by about 60 individuals who are on a registry, and law enforcement has to they're basically geo-fenced in this area. They choose to live there. They don't want to go to any housing and this other stuff. So the sanctioned camp you were speaking of earlier that's run by a nonprofit or a no profit, if you will, is this camp sanctioned through the municipality that's there? And if so, how is it sanctioned? Is it through an ordinance or something, or zoning?
So no, thank you. There are a variety of different camps. If you look at sanctioned camps in Seattle, Oakland, San Francisco, have all tried different versions. The one I'm talking about is what's called the Esperanza community outside of Austin. It was actually originally set up by the state on unused Department of Transportation land. The governor decided to clear the land that was then covered with unsanctioned camping, and they set up a distinct sanctioned camping site and then brought in the nonprofit to help manage it. You know, it took some learning activities, but it's obvious. I've been there many times, and the group is now doing some fantastic work, setting up some tiny homes, but also people that are allowed to just camp in their own sort of space and bring their own property and possessions and so
But
forth.
sanctioned through the municipality.
It's
right?
well, it's sanctioned actually just through the state in that case. Other states have sanctioned the municipality, but in that case, it's just the state sanction a section of Department of Transportation land.
And I want to be clear on the law enforcement involvement, and it got brought up a little bit earlier when we were discussing the church. If the church across the street opens up their back lawn and individuals are able to go back there and camp out and do whatever they want to do, as long as there's no infringement of public safety on anybody off the property, then unless the church reaches out to the Atlanta Police Department or somebody else and says, I have a bunch of people back here, then law enforcement's not going to be engaged. But if a person decides, and listen, there's a great book out called San Francisco, and I encourage anybody, it's written by a very progressive writer who takes a unique stance, and one that, believe me, I was a little surprised by his stance, but it was an enjoyable read. But if someone decides to camp out in front of someone's business and impact their business on a public sidewalk and law enforcement is engaged, then that officer's primary responsibility when he or she shows up to the scene is to ask that person to move.
Of course.
Ask that person to move. Offer that person resources that are available. And I'm not talking about pulling out a check and writing one, but I'm talking about telling them where the beds are and all this other kind of stuff. And if that individual refuses to give up that space, then that is a violation of a city ordinance, or in some cases, it could be a violation of Georgia law if a criminal trespass type charge is encouraged or made against the person. So in some of these situations, it's not law enforcement, but I promise you, law enforcement has a whole lot more to do, since 99% of all law enforcement citizen contacts are made through 911, not through law enforcement officers riding around looking for something to do. There's plenty to do. Law enforcement should never, and as long as I have an opportunity to have an opinion about it, will never be engaged as some jackboot force to go out there and harass and intimidate citizens. But that business owner has paid a lot of money for the licensing and everything else and the products there, and he or she have a right to operate their business unencumbered by somebody who chooses their awning to make their home. And listen, it may sound cold, but a quote that I'll give is, truth has no temperature. It's neither hot nor cold. It's the truth. And the truth is to what my fearless leader down there said, is we're here to gather as much information as possible. And a lot of the information we got this morning so far is very valuable. And some of it, I mean, I could have found on the back of many of your brochures in your sales pitch. But we are tasked with finding a solution. And if the solution is 1013ing somebody and taking them to the hospital to be evaluated, then that's the solution. But sometimes the solution is not going to be walking past an intoxicated person in 30 or 15 degree weather and saying, well, I'm going to leave them be because I don't want them to think I'm harassing or mistreating them. And I'll call the coroner tomorrow and he or she can come by and do their job. So I think we have to realize there's not a 100% one side or 100% to the other side. But I think coming up with creative ideas such as sanctioned camping is not a bad idea at all. But at the same time, I had a mother who had put her son in rehab 3 times because of his heroin and opiate addiction. And finally, she came to me and sat down and she said, I need to know what the absolute best rehab center in the state of Georgia is. And I told her it was the Muskogee County Jail because he had been stealing her jewelry and selling it. Her son went to jail. And a year after he got out of prison, where he went for 3 months, I think, spent his time in the county jail doing state time, this kid became a productive part of society and he's extremely successful now. And as much as we hate to admit it sometimes the solution, tough love's only tough on the ones that love. It's not, tough love's not tough on who we're trying to help, said the father who raised 2 kids by himself. So I appreciate your time and thank you for being informative.
Well, thank
Means a
you
lot.
too, Senator. And last thing I'd say on that is many people brought up Houston, and I would add a lot of support for what the city has done. But one thing that hasn't been mentioned is in 2017, the city council increased or strengthened the law against street camping and enforcement. And the mayor there specifically says that he takes a tough love approach, which I think has been a big part of their success.
City Journal, if somebody wants to read that.
Okay, folks, let's be back here no later than 1:15. Take a little shorter lunch. We've got a list full of folks here that want a testimony, and we're going to try to hold close to our 10 minutes on testimonies to make sure we get everybody through. This may go a little long this afternoon. Please bear with us. We're getting somewhere, I hope. Thank you. Let's be right back.